Greg was an adventurer, despite everything he'd been through. He took to the hill behind his home with firm footsteps, marching up the mile-long road like it was a path to great treasure. Even as his sister and I plodded behind him, sweat pouring down us in the stifling August heat, he turned and cried for us to keep up. How he was so animated, I didn't know. Not even grasshoppers chirruped under the midday sun, and the tall grass, usually so green, had turned to yellow straw as summer reached this peak. "Come on!" he cried as he reached a seemingly arbitrary spot on the road. "I saw it this way." He pointed into the grass, a thin footpath barely visible between wavering fronds. "What did you see?" Samantha shouted. She was usually so calm and responsible, but I could tell she was close to blowing that cool head of hers. Not long ago, Greg and Samantha had been a trio. The loss of their older brother, gone 2 years by this point, had broken their parents in an unusual way. It was not uncommon to lose children in my hometown. It felt like every year the class register grew shorter by at least 2 names. But where most parents became overprotective, Greg's had gone the other way. They grew listless and morose, withdrawing not only from the world, but their remaining children. 3 times a week, Greg and Samantha came to my house and ate food with us. The rest of the time, Samantha cooked for her family, just as she packed Greg's lunches and washed his clothes and did anything else that a parent usually did. If she'd been older, she would have probably forbidden Greg's expeditions entirely. But she was young and exhausted, and every time Greg set out to explore the wilderness at the edge of town, his face lit up so bright it must have been impossible to say no. Today, he dragged us both to see something he'd found, something that he claimed was incredible. "You have to see it for yourself," he said when we caught up with him. Samantha and I were breathless, but Greg was practically jumping on the spot with excitement. "I need a break," I whined. "A good idea, Stephen," Samantha replied between heavy breaths. "Let's just enjoy the view." We turned to face home. On our left was the forest, on our right open space, and below us, built on the sloping side of the mountain, was our hometown. Looking at it from so far, it appeared plain and small and normal. But in the corner of our eyes, drifting from the spaces between the trees of the forest, we could see the red twine. Hundreds, maybe thousands of strands floated over open air down the slope we just climbed and entered the town miles below, where it formed a complex and ever-changing web. Each string had small golden bells attached at every meter, and you'd think that with a string strung so far between such distant points that every gust of wind would create a chorus of ringing. But they were silent, and they would remain so unless someone was careless enough to touch one of the snares. "It's actually kind of beautiful," Samantha mused quietly, and I found myself agreeing. "You've checked for snares on this route?" she asked her brother. "I checked yesterday," he cried, turning to the path like a dog straining on a leash. "It's not far, it's right there." "The twine could have moved since then," she said. "I don't like this. I don't think we should be doing this. It's dangerous. Think about the golden rule." "I know the golden rule," Greg suddenly screamed. "Don't touch the thread." Greg kept shouting the phrase over and over until his face turned pink. "Did it help Jonathan?" he finally shrieked as he lost energy. "No, he was the most careful of all, and it still got him, so what's the point?" Samantha's gasp was so loud it stopped Greg's tantrum dead in its tracks. For a second, her hand twitched, and I thought she was going to hit her younger brother. But it was only the slightest of movements. "Right," she said, as stern as any headmistress. "That's it. Back we go. Stephen, I'm sorry Greg had to ruin this by being a potty mouth. Greg's face soured into regret and despair. No. You have to believe me. You have to see it. Samantha took a deep breath and knelt down to Greg's level. Do you know what the most important rule really is? Don't touch the thread, Greg sobbed. No, Samantha shook her head. The most important rule, the one that you'll one day appreciate, is the hardest of them all. Is the one that says you never, ever help someone who's touched the snare. I know that. His words were choked out between heaving breaths. No, you don't. I mean, you do, but you don't really know what it means. What it actually means is leaving someone you love behind, even if they scream, even if they cry, even when it comes to take them. You walk away, run if you can, and you don't look back. Could you do that for me, Greg? If I was lying there, crying for you to help me, could you just run away? I don't know. If I had to do that, I think it would kill me. My heart would never be whole again. Do you want to leave me for dead if something goes wrong? Greg shook his head to signal no. That's why we should turn back, Samantha continued. It's too risky. You're too excited. Do you know what it would do to me if you ran over one? Do you? Samantha swallowed and wiped her teary eyes with a cardigan sleeve. We're going home. That's final. She turned towards me and went to speak. But in the few seconds where her back was to Greg, his face scrunched up and all his anger returned. I thought he was going to leap at her and start kicking and punching, but he did something much worse. He ran into the tall grass. Samantha didn't even have time to turn around and call his name before we saw the grass disturbed and heard a loud thump followed by a twang and the ringing of a bell. The snare, wherever it was, must have been perfectly placed to catch him. There were a few agonizing seconds before Greg started crying. I could tell from his voice that my friend had seriously hurt himself. But neither Samantha nor I moved. The bell kept ringing. It would not stop. It was an unnatural sound, and one by one, the red twine in the distance began to shiver sympathetically, and 1,000 other bells joined in. The haunting sound lit up not only the mountainside, but the town below us, and I knew that already my family would be terrified to find me and know that I was safe. I wanted to run back to them, to flee the rising alarm that seized not only my thoughts, but the very air around me, as miles and miles of web thrummed with anticipation. But before I could turn, Greg appeared out of the grass and stared at us. He was, in spite of everything, silent. It must have been shock. He certainly looked like he was surprised to find several meters of ordinary-looking twine fused to the bare skin on his arms and face in coiling bunches. No blood, just swollen flesh slowly turning pink, as if it too was shocked to find its own boundaries violated and was now having a delayed reaction. Quick, invader, shut it down. But this was no microbe or allergen. Several strands of the stuff had fused to his hair and face and arms, and in places like his cheeks and ears, it had even punched through the flesh entirely and emerged on the other side. With a firm grip, it was slowly but surely beginning to pull him back into the woods. That force would only increase with every passing second until there was simply no resisting. But Greg fought on. He pushed against them and staggered towards us, reaching out a hand threaded with twine. Samantha didn't move, but she did raise a hand as if to embrace him. The sound of me crying out and falling backwards made her look away from her brother, who finally began to wail and sob. She fixed me with teary eyes, and in that moment, I watched Samantha's heart break before she turned from her weeping brother, grabbed my hand, and ran. Greg followed. Neither of us knew in detail what happened when the snare catches you, but as Greg continued to stumble after us, his cries and pleas grew increasingly furious. I darkly found myself wishing it'd just hurry up and be over with. Looking back, I'm surprised at the 10-year-old's imaginative vocabulary, but he was facing death, and I think his mind dug deep. God, he hated us in those moments. I'm sure of that. He was scared and hurting, and the only people close to him were abandoning him. He told us we'd go to hell. He told us we deserved to die. He told us a lot, not stopping until halfway down the hill, when he finally fell. I turned, not meaning or wanting to, and saw him push himself up with his hands, gravel embedded in the puffy, bleeding skin of his face. And he glared at me with burning hatred. He tried to pull at the snares embedded in his forearms, but his hands bonded to the twine immediately, and it only left him too tangled to resist any further. The twine pulled harder, and he fell backwards, and with kicking feet, he was dragged slowly out of sight. I was so afraid of what I'd seen, I sawed myself, and my vision blurred. My legs grew faint, and Samantha, barely slowing, picked me up and carried me the rest of the way. When we reached the town, my parents were waiting for us. They held me so tight that it hurt my little ribs. But I didn't care. I sobbed into my mother's arms and paid only a moment's notice to the weak, hysterical Samantha, whose own parents were nowhere to be seen. "I can't believe you bought it. I can't believe they sold it," I replied as the helicopter banked over the town below. From this high up, the snares resembled something blood-red and fleshy, the floating cilia of a strange jellyfish tangled in an artificial reef. The town, a litter of miniatures that grew from the mountainside like coral, was clearly abandoned. It had never been well looked after, not even when we lived there. But over the last few years, it had begun to look apocalyptic. "Did the government tell you any more about what they found?" Samantha asked. I looked across at the woman beside me. She looked older than her age, but there still remained a ghost of the teenage girl who'd saved my life. And if I looked further still, a hint of resemblance to her brother. Does it hurt for her to look in the mirror? I wondered. Does that familial resemblance sting? So many ghosts lingered around her, not just Greg's. 2 brothers, 2 parents. No one was around to witness the latter's abduction, but their disappearance was no mystery. How could it be? People did not go missing in my hometown. Everyone knew what it meant if someone failed to show up at breakfast or was a no-show at work or church. It meant they'd gotten careless. It meant they touched the snare and there was no coming back from that mistake. Although, in the case of Samantha's parents, it was unclear if they'd done so by accident. "They didn't find anything," I said. "Nothing concrete anyway. I think it frustrated them, this unsolvable problem. Maybe they hoped I'll throw enough money at it to figure it out. Let some billionaire spend his cash and leave their budgets alone. God knows it's what most people think when they find out I have money." An awkward silence settled between us. "Thank you," Samantha said once it had gotten on long enough. "I know you must get a lot of people asking for charity." "Don't worry," I replied, cutting her off. "I didn't mean to. It's the least I could do. He was my friend too. It's just, if that drone footage is real..." She was referring to the one bit of fruitful evidence the government had dug up. A short video taken by an aerial drone racing through overgrown trees. It lasted no more than 5 seconds, covering 100 or so meters before the machine had failed. But for the first time in mine or Samantha's life, we had finally had a glimpse into the forbidden woods which were the source of the red snares. 5 seconds of nothing. 5 seconds of blurry trees and autumnal leaves. And a frame. A single frame. A frame that was emailed to Samantha by an anonymous researcher. A frame that prompted her to call me and cash in all that guilt. I could have been angry to find this ghost of my childhood returned, demanding I spend millions on some whim. But I wasn't. She had sent me the image, and I immediately knew what she wanted and why. 6 months later, and I'd managed to bribe enough officials to let me purchase the derelict and empty remains of my hometown. The image was of Greg. A blurred shadow recognizable only by the distinct make and coloring of his clothes. Details burned into both mine and Samantha's memories. Details neither of us could forget. No, you could not see his face. But we didn't have to. We knew it was him anyway. Samantha's expression grew sad as her eyes fell to the window where the town passed directly beneath us. We were slowing as the chopper approached the landing site. I briefed the pilot that the situation was fluid, and he would need to keep a keen eye out for a place free of snares. A glance at the direction he was taking told me he was heading straight for the church. "Do you know what it was like in the end?" she asked, eyes still on the town. Even from this height, we could see thousands of snares snaking from building to building, window to window, through abandoned cars and around tilting telephone poles. A cat's cradle of shimmering red twine. "My dad called a few weeks before he disappeared," I answered. "Every couple of months he'd call and go through the list. Every time it got smaller. In the end, he was just one person. I asked if it had been a good month, if people had been extra careful. He told me there just weren't enough people to go missing anymore. In the end, he was the last, too stubborn and refused to move." Down below, the church raced into view. In the months since the town had emptied, the once impeccable kept grass had been left to grow wild and unkempt in the autumn heat. I wondered what it might hide, so I leaned forward and got the pilot's attention. "Radio the guys on the ground and tell them not to step on the grass," I shouted. They used to keep it short for a reason. The pilot gave me a thumbs up before speaking into his mic, standing sheepishly at the edge of the old lawn. 3 small figures looked up at us and waved to get our attention. When I first paid for the expedition to enter the town and map its contents, there had been 4, 2 scientists and 2 former soldiers hired as security. It didn't surprise me, looking down, that we were missing one of the scientists. "It's worse than before." Dr. Wagner, the expedition scientist, looked at me with curiosity as we picked our way carefully down Main Street. "It wasn't unusual for one of the roads to have a few snares across it," I added, "but the air is practically red with the stuff." "Perhaps it has become frustrated with the lack of food," she replied. "You think it eats them?" I asked, and she nodded. "Seems possible," I added as I studied a nearby shop window. A little boutique that sold dresses, the kind women would wear to church. I remember waiting outside while my mother perused inside for what felt like hours on end. Sometimes I would grow impatient and want to go inside too, but something about the mannequin in the window scared me. Faceless, featureless, hard plastic limbs. What was it about the lack of eyes that left me convinced it was looking right at me? It had only gotten worse with age. Its head a Rorschach of peeling paint, beige and white on tarnished gunmetal greys. It must be intelligent, sentient if not sapient, Wagner said as I turned away from the unsettling doll. The scientist was a small woman in her late 40s, usually quite brazen and funny, but 24 hours in this town had already worn her down. It knew to target the objects that Mike, Dr. Mignola, touched regularly. I cringed at the reminder of the expedition's losses. It isn't just intelligent, I said. It's vindictive. Did I tell you what happens if you damage the thread? She shook her head. One man set fire to a whole bunch of snares on his lawn, I told her. Used a can of spray paint and his lighter. Woke up the next day to find a snare punched right through his belly and tied to a bed spring on the other side. The scientist winced at the thought. But I left out the part where the man had stayed in his bed for a full 2 days before he was finally driven mad by the itch of the twine running through his guts. I'd heard from some older kids that in the end he tore at himself like an animal in a trap, and in a rare twist, the twine did not take him. It left his body there, skewered on a piece of string, and the doctor had to come round with a couple farmers and cut him out. But still, the twine stayed fixed and taut so that his family could not get rid of anything it touched. Not the sheets, not the mattress, not even the half-inch or so of flesh the twine had bonded to. The stink of infection infested the house, they said, and on hot summer days, it even reached the streets. It must have been hell living here. Why would anyone stay? Most people didn't. Just about everyone my age left as soon as they got old enough. Town went from 5,000 to a few hundred in just a couple decades, I replied. When my dad was a kid, there were maybe 2 or 3 snares at the time. Few enough that if you got tangled, others would cut you out without too much risk to themselves. Hurt like hell, mind, but survivable. By the time it got real bad, some people were just too old or stubborn. Plus, I suspect some stayed in the hope those taken would come back. My father was definitely in that camp. At least you got out, Wagner said. If you'd stayed, you would have either been taken already or probably gone insane from the loneliness. I understood her words, but I didn't feel them. People who were born into this were never really normal. I couldn't go to the bathroom without checking the door 5 times each way. Sleep was short, fitful at best, since that was always when you were most vulnerable. From what I understood, most people who'd left the town hadn't fared so well. I suppose, I shrugged, and we continued to carefully step over strands of red twine that thrummed with excitement as our feet passed over. We got maybe halfway down Main Street before Wagner tripped, fell, and set off the first of the snares. Drop it. She lowered her backpack without taking her eyes off it. Lucky Woman had fallen in such a way her bag had taken the hit, but already other snares started to gum up the fabric. They attracted each other somehow. You never saw them move. They just appeared when you weren't looking, almost like they were always there. But a quick person could beat them. Jesus, I cried. Step away. Wagner ran over to me as dozens more snares appeared, wrapped around a backpack. Slowly, they began to constrict, melding into and right through the material, looking for the flesh of its owner, while still dragging it further into the web so more snares could seize it. Slowly but surely, the bag was dragged into the darkness of a nearby alley. "That was close," the scientist said once the bag was out of sight. I didn't bother chastising her. No one could really get used to this kind of place. You had to live with it for years before the lessons it taught you sank in. I merely offered to take a short break, sharing what little food I had, before the pair of us continued. At least she was a little more watchful going forward. Nothing more I could ask for. The journey dragged on for hours with our pace so slow. We used the time to document what we saw, the state of the town, crumbling buildings, twine punctured glass without shattering it, blending perfectly with wood, rock, metal and plastic, where one end met man-made structures while the other ran off towards the horizon, inevitably disappearing into the darkness beneath the forest's canopy. From there, no one knew where it led. Only that disappearing into the woods meant you never came back. Meanwhile, the silence bore down on us. I wasn't used to it. Certainly not here of all places, what was once a home to me. But aside from us moving and speaking, there was nothing to break up the eerie silence, and even then, our words felt intrusive and dangerous, like we might catch the attention of something lurking just out of sight, perhaps somewhere behind the windows that peered down on us. Old, grey and grimy, the rooms beyond hidden like islands in the fog. The only splash of colour, the red twine that ensnared the spaces within those decrepit rooms. Hardware shops, florists, record stores, apartments once occupied by people who had left no one behind to claim their things. So now toasters and TVs and ovens and fridges and all manner of personal items lingered on, gathering no dust because there was no one to shed skin and create some. I felt watched by those windows. Slowly but surely my paranoia spiked, like a child in a haunted house convinced that something was waiting to jump out. Wagner spoke to me in places, and I just ignored her, willing her into silence out of fear of something coming along. At one point, she had to grab me to get my attention. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. And I realized for the first time, it wasn't just me who'd been feeling the pressure. I listened. There it was, a tinkle of a bell. But unlike the ones I'd heard when a snare was touched, this was gentle, playful, singular, a lone bell, a lone piece of twine somewhere, being played with like a cat batting a toy. "What the hell?" I muttered, clearly more baffled by this than Wagner. The bells did not ring alone. I knew this. Everyone in the town knew this. They always screamed in unison. As quickly as it came, it stopped. But we investigated anyway, pulled by the law into the doorway of a shop. I went first, Wagner close behind. When she saw the figure standing there, she gasped, but whatever noise I wanted to make was caught in my throat. At first, I assumed it was another person, but their stock-still pose could not have been achieved by anyone with a pulse. It was a mannequin. The mannequin. The one I'd studied at the other end of the street. It even wore the same clothes. It had been punctured by snares in dozens of places. The head, the neck, the elbow and knees. So much so it resembled a marionette. And even as the comparison popped into my head, it turned to face us. Stiff rotation achieved by the tug of a twine. With more stilted movement, it reached out and held up Wagner's bag, suddenly unharmed, albeit a little scuffed. "Should I?" Wagner almost reached out. "Hell no," I cried while snatching her wrist. "I've never seen anything like this. But geez, if it doesn't look like a trap, I don't know what does. No. We need to move. We need to find the others and get the hell on with this expedition. No more notes." "Radio the others," I added while glaring at the empty street, watching for signs of further movement behind all that dull and lifeless grass. It's time to move into the woods. Samantha and I were standing on the crest of the same hill where Greg had fallen over 20 years ago. Only now the air was cooler and the grass greener, and plenty of birds chirruped in the nearby trees. It had seemed through no gentle twist of fate we'd been brought to the trail he'd singled out years ago. "This is definitely what the satellite picked out?" I asked while Samantha chewed anxiously on her thumb. "This is the route," Wagner replied. "Why, is there something wrong with it?" "It's just that the infrared and elevation scans made it clear. If we want to enter the forest, this is our best bet." "No, if you're sure, you're sure," I said, while briefly nudging a child's shoe back into the long grass. I could only hope Samantha hadn't noticed. "Come on," one of the soldiers said while taking point. "We need to get moving, or else we'll risk getting stuck here in the dark." The woods were surprisingly free of snares, but for the last century, the townspeople had treated it like cursed land, and it seemed so had the wildlife. No trails, no paths, no sign of intervention by humans or animals. Nothing dared to encroach on these trees, to weather down their grip on the earth. They grew over one another like people in a jostling crowd. Roots left to thicken and fight tooth and nail, crowding so tightly they burst through the soil and crawled over one another like something in a mangrove swamp. You didn't hike through this forest. You crawled along on your hands and knees, climbing steep inclines one moment, gripping gnarled roots like the rungs of a ladder before descending the other side in reverse. "Was this place always free of snares?" one of the soldiers asked. "Honestly, I don't know," I replied. Both Samantha and I had been shocked by the fact that neither of us had talked since noticing it. "No one went into the woods," Samantha added as the same man helped her over a particularly steep set of roots. "It wasn't even a matter of being forbidden. It was just that if you entered, you never returned." "High stakes for a hike," he replied. "I'm not sure I'm being paid enough to never see the sun again." "Well, we've walked, 30 minutes? And we're still alive," Wagner said. "Maybe people just got lost. Nothing says—" Wagner was climbing beside Sam as she spoke. Only her words came to a startling halt before she could finish. She cried out, lost her footing, and tumbled backwards. But as she fell, her cries grew shrill and almost hysterical, and I rushed over to help, unsure of what had happened. When I reached her, she was on her back, clutching an old piece of root. In a blur, she threw it far away from herself and began to point at something inside the roots. "Oh no," she muttered while hyperventilating. "Oh my God," Samantha cried as her eyes picked out what had upset Wagner. It took a second to see it. I had crawled over that exact spot just moments ago and noticed nothing. But there it was. A moss-covered bundle of leathery and mottled skin, the features below so brutalized by decay that it was scarcely recognizable as anything that might have once skittered or skulked around these woods. A deer. Dead, desiccated, taken years before. Poor Wagner had gripped one of its bony limbs, mistaking it for a root. It was nearly identical due to the moss covering it, but only the slimy give of its skin beneath her fingers had clued her in. And then, once she saw those hollow eyes gazing back at her from the darkness, well, it's a wonder she hadn't screamed the whole place down. "Looks like it died and got caught up in the tree roots," one of the soldiers said as he took a closer look. "Do you think it touched one of the snares?" Wagner asked as she rubbed her hands clean on her trousers. "Guys? Does it even take animals?" Wagner added. "It can," I replied. "Guys? Weren't allowed pets because of it," Samantha added. "Birds seem to avoid the snares instinctively, but cats, dogs, anything like that really didn't fare so well." "Guys!" one of the soldiers shouted from the nearest deadfall, where he peeked over the top. "I found the townspeople." They moved. Chasing them or walking towards them was a sure way to get lost, and the soldiers let us know that empathetically. We were to continue as is, penetrating deeper into the forest in the hope of finding something, anything that gave us answers. Meanwhile, all we could do was ignore the strange figures that bobbed amongst the trees. Limp bodies, hanging arms, drooping heads, hair full of twigs and leaves, mouths full of soil, moss-coated skin, pallid and soft. Dead bodies suspended like puppets in twine. They didn't run if you approached them. They merely drifted away as if the hands that controlled them were taking them off stage. This was the first time in my life I'd seen the red thread used for something other than snares. Somehow, this felt worse. "Guys," I said after we marched for another hour, "I think we can safely say how that image of Greg was taken." I gestured to one of the bodies that floated amidst the trees, its body swaying in unseen currents. "Are we sure we need to go further?" "He's right," one of the soldiers said as he dropped his bag and began to roll out his shoulders and back. "I don't like this one bit, and we now know the context of that screen grab. I know I'm not paying for this whole thing, but I think it's time to call it a day." He reached down and grabbed the bag, ready to pull one strap over his shoulder. When we heard it, how had we been so stupid? The woods had never been free of snares. It was just another way of getting us to lower our guard. When the soldier had reached for the bag, his hand, bare skin even, had brushed against a snare that had appeared when our eyes were turned. A dozen brass bells rang out from the contact, and slowly, joining in one by one, 1,000, a million others joined. A deafening, maddening, ear-splitting cry. The most unnatural thing I've ever heard in my life. Decades gone without it, but here it was, once more, powerful enough to make me feel like a weeping child waiting to be grabbed by Samantha's arms. The soldier looked at me, terrified. "You said there weren't any in the forest," he cried, pale as a ghost. I began to stammer. I wanted to say we'd made no promises, that I'd only agreed with others' observations. But what would that achieve? "Calm down," I shouted instead, but he tried to run towards us. Already, new snares had appeared to tangle up his feet, binding to his clothes, wrapping around his limbs from that ever-rising panic that made him thrash about. The man was going to die. Destined to. It was too late. Maybe if we'd taken it slowly, reacted just right. But that ship had sailed now. He was bound in dozens of them, and as he continued to panic, it only grew worse. They melted into his scalp, his cheeks, his brow, his hands, and where his top rode up in the mad struggle. They now began to well to his chest and back. "No, no, 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 no." He muttered the words over and over. His friend took a step towards him, but I held out a hand to stop him. What could he do? The soldier continued to thrash in fear. Anyone who got near him would end up touching a snare, and there was no coming back from that. His panic made him as dangerous to us as he was to himself. We had to watch as the snares ramped up their pressure, dragging him with increasing speed up and over a cluster of roots. Oh no. Wagner was the first to notice. The snares did not run over all the roots. They went through them, under them. Their path was a complicated weave in and out of ancient boughs and roots. Don't watch, was all I managed to say as his body hit the first of many split directions. As one, we turned away. Samantha scrunched the face, trying as hard as she could to shut out any and all light. Wagner clasped her hands over her ears to block out the sound of breaking bone. But there was no escaping those screams. She surely must have heard them. And the remaining soldier? For some reason, he watched. When it was done, there was only blood-slicked tree limbs, torn and shredded clothes, and a grown man on his knees throwing up and crying from what he'd just seen. And behind us, all around us, all except for a single root ahead, the snares had returned. So many, the air thrummed like a dropped guitar. So many, it was hard to see further than a few meters in any direction. So many that the message they sent was clear. After all, the timing of the first snare could not have been an accident. Whatever lay them was telling us as loud as it could. There's no turning back. We did not hear the soldiers' cries, but we heard the struggle. I'm still not sure what happened, only that by the time we turned, he was 1 foot off the ground, his mouth a mask of twine so thick it resembled a writhing nest of earthworms, a faceless body floating, his limbs shivering from the overwhelming agony. God, I hope that if you can die of pain, it at least happens quickly. And his face a quivering, ever-shifting bundle of blood red. The sight was like a nightmare, and it was all the worse that we hadn't even seen it happen. If it hadn't been for one of his shoes falling off as he had a seizure, we might never have even known he was gone. But that wasn't the worst of it. No. The worst was that he came back. Wagner noticed first. She was already at the rear. When it became apparent to her that another person had floated up behind and was now just a few meters away, she mewed a desperate cry for help, and Samantha and I turned in unison. The man who'd been taken just an hour before had resumed his position at the back of the group. He bobbed along the woodland floor, but his feet did not touch the ground. If we approached, he moved away just like the others, but unlike them, he was being paraded in full view, close behind to make sure we stayed on track. If we took a step, he took a step as well, bounding along in mock imitation of us. Whatever had happened to him in the canopy, he looked broken now, crunched, crumpled, Play-Doh squeezed in a fist of an angry child. Sunken eyes and a toothless mouth hung low, his dislocated jaw swinging freely as saliva collected on a swollen tongue. Just like the mannequin, with a stiff arm, the twine moved him and gestured for us to carry on. At last, after the hours had gone on for so long, the sky turned a dull grey, ready for nightfall. We found it. A clearing in the woods as large as any stadium, and there before us lay what I could only describe as a congregation. And like many great gatherings held in secret and silence, they knelt in supplication, heads pressed to the floor, skin and hair withered away, or at least marred by the filth around them that they were hard to tell apart. Individual identity meant little in this crowd. The clothes, too, were close to falling apart, but all these people on their knees, somehow their shoes still told a story. Leather boots, brogues, moccasins, slippers, trainers, Chucks, Nikes, Doc Martens, boomers to millennials, 3 generations of a town brought to their knees. Bright and colourful, stern and businesslike, the elderly and the young alike lay before us. Dead men and women praying. To a woman bound in twine. She was not another floating marionette. This was immediately apparent. Her features were not hidden, her skin not marred by soil. Her hair, a rich chestnut brown, was long and flowing. Her clothes, what little we could see beneath a cocoon of red twine, was a pale white gown. But time had not left her alone. Her head was a withered skull, her mouth a leering gape. A corpse as surely as any other, but free from the abuse of a life on the forest floor, for she floated high amongst the trees, thousands of red snares emerging from her body to suspend her in the center of an explosion of red lines that radiated out from her core. Beneath her lay the remnants of an ancient bonfire. Above her, the branches and canopy had been scorched black, but the woman appeared to have been untouched by the flame, a ghostly image of death. She was like something out of a Renaissance painting, beautiful and haunting, otherworldly and divine. The sight of her made my heart break, even if I couldn't say why. "Who is she?" Wagner asked, her voice choked with tears. All at once, the bodies turned to face us, moving from their bowed position just enough to fix us with vacant, cloudy eyes. Greg was one of those many. I spotted him nearby, still a child. He glared at me with empty sockets that seemed darker than any shadow, like a flicker of his betrayal remained alive within him. Had he worn that furious expression for all these years? I wanted to answer Wagner's question, but the answer froze in my throat. I had no definitive proof, but couldn't see the betrayal on the woman's face, couldn't see the hatred in her hollow eyes. God, being stood there, it felt wrong, felt dangerous. It felt like I just wandered into Chernobyl and was making direct contact with the elephant's foot. Whoever that woman was, she radiated hate the same way the sun radiates heat. Whatever the details of her, there was no mistaking the intensity of her contempt for us. I'd spent decades wondering what force or creature could hate my town so much that it would torture us for nearly 3 decades. Looking at her, I understood easily where that cruelty came from. A witch burned, perhaps? I never heard of that in our history. And who burns a witch in the 90s? But who knows what happens in the deep woods? Who knows what atrocities are committed in the dark, and so far from watching eyes? Then again, did she need justification to hate us? A part of me felt like I was standing before a god of some kind, and who knows what they do or do not take offense to. After all, do you explain to an ant why you crush it? As if hearing my thoughts, she turned to face me, dead but alive, rotting but whole. And for a brief passing instant, I saw enough to render the world white, for blood to come bubbling out of my ears in a warm stream I wouldn't notice for hours more. And then, after that, silence, darkness. My final thought was the realization that I'd been right. I had just heard a god speak. From the town came church bells. Even from where we sat on the hood of a car miles away awaiting extraction, I could see the glow in the tower. The town had come alive at last. Our journey from the woods had not been alone. Her congregation, easily 1,000 rotting bodies, floated down behind us, and she came in tow, looming over all like some nightmarish puppeteer. Only when we reached the bottom of the hill and past the first building did the woman in red move into the lead, where she slowly took her congregation to the center of the town. There she remains even now, still floating, still bound in a million threads. But her congregation moved on. Greg returned home, my father too, hand in hand with my mother, the woman he'd loved so much there wasn't much room for me. Others had work to do. Shopkeepers flipped close signs to open, switches were flicked, barbers' poles came to life, neon signs began to thrum and glow. Light flooded the nighttime streets as ancient bulbs flickered once, twice, and then finally fell into a steady hum. All of them, lifeless bodies manipulated by the twine, cloudy eyes, brains as inert as lumps of insulation. And yet, they were animated, with just enough hints of a former life as to make me wonder what exactly the woman in red had been doing with them up there for all those years. Either way, the facsimile was shocking. If you could ignore all the snares and the strange way its citizens floated and bobbed along, the town almost appeared normal, as life began to slowly flood back in. It had been a miracle to get electricity back on so quickly, but the woman in red brooked no argument. Her demands were many, and if I hadn't accepted them, she would have boiled my brains right there in that clearing. "What happens when we die one day?" Samantha asked as we watched houses light up one by one. "What happens if there's a power cut? She can move the cars on her own, but electricity?" "I don't know," I replied while shaking my head. But already I was thinking of ways to install a generator, something the twine could maybe move in emergencies, enough to keep the town going while I took care of the rest. But I'd really rather not find out what happens if she doesn't get her own way. I collect random home VHS tapes. A simple hobby, very niche too, so it can be quite cheap compared to more common hobbies. A lot of young people clearing out their deceased relatives' home find tapes in droves, either blanks or random taped shows. There's a fun feeling to finding snippets of old shows. Sometimes they're not even well documented, and there are forums dedicated to post findings too. People love finding lost episodes of the shows of old. There are many in the space who solely dedicate themselves to this side of the hobby, but personally, I like the real-life loot box feeling of simply watching what's on the tapes. I have a room dedicated to my collections. On top of my memorabilia sections, which are some toys and collectibles from shows I used to love, I have two main shelves. One of random shows that I label and categorize. The other shelf is of home videos that were mixed in with the blanks or unmarked VHS batches. These I collect after I try get back in touch with the seller to try send them back to no avail. As for the blanks, I have them boxed away. I later resell them since I have no use for them. One of these tapes, however, has taken my whole attention. It came in a box of mostly blanks, white labels unmarred, except for one, which had most of its sticker blacked out with a thick marker. Either there was something written on it that was blocked over, or it was heavily marked to stand out from the rest. If that was the case, it worked, because I picked it out immediately. I haven't acquired a new tape since, because I've been obsessed over this one. So, I'm sharing its contents that I've seen so far. Once you see what I mean, you'll know why. And you'll know why you can never see it. It started with my first watch. I made sure it was fully rewound and sat back, hoping it was a good one. The shot started with a man at his desk. He seemed to be working on something challenging, as all his attention was on the papers in front of him. His brow furrowed constantly as he meticulously chipped away at the mountain of literature in front of him. It seemed rather inane at first, just a man working hard, and for some reason filming himself. I hoped the scene would develop, trying to piece together a plot if this scene was from an old TV show. This made my eyes wander, hoping something would happen. But as he continued to dive deeper into his work, I noticed a mirror slightly off-angle behind him. A common narrative device in more artsy visual storytelling. In it was a small snippet of the wall behind the camera. Every time he pulled his head up from his desk, he would clip into the frame of the mirror. But something seemed off. I couldn't figure out what I found off about it, but keeping an eye on it made the many minutes of this shot more amusing to watch, as I wasn't getting any enjoyment from watching a man struggling late into a 9 to 5. There was one part that solidified what seemed strange about it though. It was when he swung back far to stretch his back out a bit. As he ended up in the mirror's frame for a bit longer than usual, I noticed this reflection wasn't perfectly mirroring his actions. It seemed a bit out of sync, almost like the reflection wasn't a reflection, but another person trying to be a reflection. I thought it could have been a shoddy attempt from the director of trying to replicate a mirror. However, that seemed way too elaborate for this kind of work. Once I noticed this, the offness became much more apparent. Even on the tiny snippets, the reflection seemed to be like he was slightly more turned than he should have been, or just a few frames too late in response. Before I knew it, the scene ended, the tape snapped black, and the whir of the VHS player span to rewind. It was the end of the tape. It was only about 20 minutes, but the time flew by after my fun little game started. So, as soon as it clicked back to the start of the tape, I immediately hit play to try see how early this strange, unsynced mirror started. But, instead of a man at a desk, it was something else entirely. It was now a woman in a shopping aisle. She was deciding between two similar brands of cereal and trying to figure out which one she wanted. It seemed the decision between strawberry or chocolate was a hard one, because she was at this for a while. But while she was engrossed in her thoughts, something in the background started to move. A colourful box of cereal slightly further up the aisle started to shift slightly. It moved so slowly that she took no notice. However, I could see it in full, just slowly inching out little by little. Eventually, it was almost all the way out, teetering on the middle of its own weight before it toppled over and fell. She immediately turned at the noise of it hitting the ground, staring at it for a few moments. Once she realized it was just a box that fell, she went back, picked up the strawberry option, put it in a basket, and walked away. At this, the scene ended, and the tape went back to black and started rewinding. This established the pattern of my new obsession. For a start, this scene wasn't nearly as long as the first one, yet it still hit the end of the tape. And more importantly, it was completely different to what was on the tape before. I hit play once more, and once again, it was a different scene entirely. I don't know how it worked, but I knew I had something strange in my possession. So, I took to seeing what else would happen if I kept watching the tape over and over. At first for fun, but later, not so much. I took to the forums, but as you can imagine, they were no help. This obviously wasn't how tapes worked, so even the most vague description of my first experience was either ignored or made fun of. But this didn't deter me. I never did this hobby for attention, so since then, I've just kept this to myself, something I can enjoy in my free time. And plus, it saved me money too. I no longer had to hunt down new tapes, knowing this one provided new content to watch each time. It was my own personal heaven, the goose that laid golden eggs. My next few watches went similar to my first two. A person sitting at a park feeding ducks, but instead of ducks, disheveled children came to eat the bread, which the patron didn't seem to bat an eye to. A man fervently driving his car, making sharp turns to the wheel and looking around frantically, which, after a slow, long zoom out, the car turned out to be unmoving, stuck in a ditch. Some impatient patrons outside a bar waiting for it to be open, yet the building looked derelict and boarded up, so it couldn't open. They were like little dark comedies, twisted punchlines for no one to appreciate but me. But my last watch of that night set a different tone. The scene was of a figure lying in a bed. The skin was jet black, charred and crisp. Wisps of steam danced around the body. Between the dried cracks of skin, there were thin lines of red where it split. This caught my attention as it was significantly different from any of the previous times I viewed the tape. They were dead still, the camera too. The only light colour in this dark scene was their eyes, leaking softly out of the sockets. After many chilling minutes of silence, the body twitched once, then twice, then started spasming violently, jitters and jumps, flinging around wildly periodically, until it was all they were doing. As they constantly span around and writhed, colour slowly returned to their skin. Panic restored on their slowly forming face. I figured they were screaming, but couldn't confirm with a lack of audio. Eventually, they were back to human. A middle-aged woman twitching in her bed until she settled down back to a peaceful slumber. No sign of danger on the way, like they somehow burned alive and their tape was reversed, yet no fire was ever seen. I thought this was a hint to reverse the tape, so I hit rewind to see if anything would change. But when the scan line shot around and the tape whirred, the shot went to black. And for the rest of that scene, no picture showed. That was a new lesson I'd learned. Any interference with the tape, and it would cut to black until the tape ended and rewound itself. The next day, I took off work. I wanted to see as much as possible. Even though some of the snippets were a bit dark, seeing it through the scan lines of an old CRT TV dampened the blow somewhat. My thirst for knowledge had just gotten started. I sat down with my early morning coffee and popped in the tape. The first watch started with an over-the-shoulder shot of an elderly man standing in front of his bathroom mirror. Though I couldn't see him directly, I could make him out clearly through the cleaned mirror he stared into. He stared intently at his reflection, seemingly willing it to do something. After a few tense moments, he slowly raised his right hand and hesitantly waved at himself. The reflection followed along. which seemed to anger the man slightly, the reflection mimicking his furrowed demeanor. He tried again, slowly raising his hand, giving an uneasy wave, and again the reflection seemed to follow along, perfectly reflected. He tried this over and over, the same movements, the same reactions. I almost thought the tape was looping, until he started acting more and more frantic, waving and waving, not seeming to get the reaction he wanted. Defeated, his shoulders sunk, and he turned to leave. But his reflection didn't, and it continued to stare in the direction of the camera. The tape ended there. After the whir of the VHS stopped, I hit play again. This next scene faded into a panning shot of a room full of plushes and toys, a mix of relatively old releases and very retro collectibles, from old mechas to soft plushes. Though I could tell there was some marring from dust, they looked like they were placed with pride, something I did myself with my own collection. After the slow pan, the shot centered on one of the dolls in the middle of one of the shelves. Slowly it zoomed in, the frame getting smaller and smaller. However, as some of the toys were getting cropped out of the shot on the sides, I swear I could see them twitch a little. Some would lean as if pushed slightly, but some looked more deliberate, like a leg jerking or a joint pivoting. Eventually, the camera was so zoomed in that only a few toys remained, and when enlarged on screen, I could see it more clearly. Toys were moving autonomously when they were almost out of shot, like their timing was just off from trying not to be caught or trying to be deliberate enough for me to see. Eventually, the shot landed squarely on the centered toy's eye, a disturbing, extreme close-up of the glossy bead that made up part of its face. The shot lingered for a good few moments before its eye blinked and the scene cut. Each watch seemed to bring something new, yet I pieced together that there seemed to be a vague, reoccurring theme of mirrors, and the eye stood out to me as it made me think back to the woman in bed. I watched the tape over and over, taking small breaks to eat and do general tasks throughout the day. But when away from the screen, my mind never left my one-seater in front of my dusty CRT TV. If the tape was coming up with these scenes on the fly, then it never seemed to run out of ideas. However the effects were done, they were pulled off immaculately, way ahead of their time. If there was some trick to the tape that did this, like it was somehow connected online, pulling random horror scenes from lesser-known movies, it was beyond me. Like the goose that laid golden eggs analogy I've already mentioned, I didn't want to cut the goose open out of greed. After eating the quickest meal I could make, I popped back into my collector's room, hoping to get some new watches in before bed. Even though I took off work, I knew I couldn't stay up obscenely late. The scene sparked to life with flickers. The lighting seemed to be sketchy in the room, but when it lingered long enough between the flashes, I saw tile and old bottles. It was a ceramic-coated bathroom, a sterile white veneer that screamed cheap rent. Eventually, there was a final crack of energy, and the bulb clung to life enough to light the scene. The camera led with a tilt up, tracking across the bathroom floor. All the while, an occasional sloshing could be heard, the tub sounding very full. Sometimes a squeaking sound would sting, like skin shifting on porcelain, the movements of someone uncomfortable in the bath. The camera tracked up, slowly leading to the lip of the tub, where the sloshing and jostling got louder. The frame lingered level to the edge for a few moments, not revealing the innard of the tub, and the first sign that something was off was when some of the liquid spilled over the edge. It was only slight, but a thin red streak glistened down in a fast red line. This was the camera's cue to lift over. The reveal was not what I wanted. The liquid was a viscous and thick red, rumbling with little movements underneath. A meek struggle beneath the shallow depths. Occasionally, a pale arm or leg would bob up briefly, momentarily freeing itself to the surface before plunging back under. An arm, a leg, and an arm again, like they were coming up for air in sporadic intervals, yet no head ever came up. The shifting became more erratic, so much so that the liquid looked like it was boiling. The water splashed over the lip, spilling over the now pink-hued floor, until it all came to a sudden still, and whatever was under rested on the surface. The parts weren't of a person trapped under the water, but many parts dismembered. Arms and legs of a half-dozen similar-looking people. The only one that wasn't a limb was an eye that floated haplessly in the middle. The tape cut black. After this, I was unsettled. Sure, there was some things that bordered on dark that I'd seen before, but this was so many steps up. The others I could pass off as tricks of the camera, or at best, the conjurings from the mind of directors being too experimental. But this went too far. I cut my viewing session shorter than I'd wanted that night. At work, I weighed up if I should just stop. Let me tell you, if I had, life would have been simple. I'd go back to working my regular job and hunting for tapes in my spare time. But as you can tell, the story doesn't end here. See, this hobby had me addicted. The thrill of finding some rare or unique footage was exhilarating. I'm sure you can liken it to the biggest rush in whatever hobby you're into. Make your own simile for how it feels. So to get that on demand, rather than waiting days for a listing to show up, fighting over others like me in a bidding war, and then waiting the sometimes weeks for it to get here because sellers cheap out so much on shipping, and that also causes some tapes to be wrecked by the time they arrive, not to mention package thieves. It was easy for me to cope that last episode was a one-off, something that could just randomly happen in the pool of footage it seemed to hold. So maybe I could keep going? What were the odds of something like that happening again? I decided to challenge those odds. I tried to resist when I got home, give myself some breathing room for a bit, but after finishing some chores around the house and taking some time to make a nice meal, the downtime was deafening, and I wanted to fill it with my obsession. The tape was already in the player, untouched since the bathtub scene. I sat down and hit play. The camera panned over a serene park on a cloudy day, and the camera revealed a young woman on a bench. The camera was close enough to make out the name tag on her chest. Anna. She looked like she was feeling directionless and came to the park to try and clear her head. She gazed up, lost in her mind for a while, eyes glazed in thought. But something got her attention and snapped her out of her stupor. A whisper in the wind that caught her off guard, yet I could hear it too. "Look up," was all it said in a low, soothing voice. She must have been desperate, because instead of looking around or even contemplating whether or not to follow a randomly given direction, she followed it like divine intervention. Anna stared at the dull sky, scanning around for something, though not knowing what. But it didn't take long for her to find what she was looking for. Anna's face switched through so many emotions. Whatever had her attention must have been otherworldly, because I can't think of anything that could appear in an open sky that would garner that kind of reaction. Maybe the clouds sending a message or a vision of some sort. I would never know, because the shot only stayed on her. Her face settled on beheld. Something in the sky had her smitten in a divine way. Anna was soaking in the bliss of whatever she gazed upon. Hope returned to her face, which seemed like something she'd been missing for a long time. However, the sky soon got darker. A thick cloud passed over the lowering sun, and her face dropped. Whatever she was looking at twisted, something grotesque, yet she never once looked away. And the scene ended. Hooked on the mystery, I hit play again. The room in the opening was sterile. A large mirror was centered on the wall that was obviously a two-way to me, but not to who they were observing. The subject was a girl, definitely in the single digits of age. She was in a hospital gown with pajamas underneath, and in front of her were a number of old dolls. A clack sounded, and over a fuzzy intercom speaker, a voice asked her, "Can you talk to one of the dolls?" "Okay," she replied meekly, and she proceeded to introduce herself to the first one. "Not that one," a low voice said, though it didn't have the intercom static like the previous voice. "It said not this one," she said back. The interviewer must have been confused by this, as there was a pause of contemplation before he reformed a new question. "Which doll is speaking, honey?" It seemed that the girl could hear the voice, as could I, but the man observing, and possibly others behind the screen, could not. She turned back to the dolls and asked them who was speaking. "Me," the low voice responded. She turned towards the doll in the middle and pointed at it. "Okay, honey. Can you ask him some questions for me?" the man said. She obeyed. When addressed, the doll seemed to move slightly, almost as if trying to turn to face her. However, she was unfazed by this. "What is it that you want, child?" the doll quizzed, which she repeated back to the hidden man. The man on the other side of the two-way mirror, intrigued by the doll's response, asked, "Can you ask him who he is?" The girl turned back to the doll and repeated the question. The doll's head tilted slightly, as if considering its answer. "I am a vessel," it said, its voice a groan, which she echoed back. The silence lingered as the man seemed to ponder more about what to ask. But just as he hit the intercom button, sounding that awful clack, I was about to ask the doll another question. Something happened. The doll's eyes began to twitch, blinking rapidly, unsynced, and its head spun around to face the two-way mirror. "I see you," the doll said, its voice echoing throughout the room. "I see all of you." The man frantically called out, "What's going on? What is he saying?" It seemed they had never encountered anything like this before. But before she could answer, the doll spoke again. "The eye sees all," it said, "and now the experiment ends." With that, the doll fell silent, its eyes returning to their normal, lifeless state. There was no response as the girl asked over and over if she could be let out, unfazed by the whole ordeal, as the static rattled out from the intercom from the button that was still held down. No more voices came from behind the screen. The scene abruptly cut to black. I'd seen a handful of thematics of eyes, or rather a singular eye, but this was the first true mention addressing it as some sort of thing. This was enough for me for the night, so I turned in, now wanting to figure out the narrative theme of the clips. The weekend was the perfect time to try and pack this. I swore that I'd watch over and over, no matter what I saw. I was in deep, and I wanted to weather the deep end for a satisfying conclusion. If something disturbing came up, I'd simply get over it and watch again. There was a message here, and I wanted to figure it out. Scene after scene, I watched the tape over so many times that day. A shot of a person sitting on a couch reading a book. As the camera zoomed in on the book, I realized that it was not a normal one. It was some ancient tome with a strange symbol on the front. A scene of a person standing in front of a window, watching the rain fall. As the camera zoomed in on the raindrops, I saw that they were not normal water droplets. They were black and oily, and they seemed to be eating away at the window pane. The person was nonchalant about his impending danger. A shot of a man walking through a forest at night, with strange symbols etched on the trees. He hears strange, otherworldly whispers all around him, but can't make out what's being said. Suddenly, a figure appears behind him, its face hidden. The figure speaks in a soft, whispered voice, promising to reveal the secrets of the universe to the person if they're willing to make a sacrifice. The person hesitates, but the figure's words are hypnotic, and they find themselves drawn in. The scene ends with the person making a pact with the figure, the details of which are left unclear. I had a pad and paper to jot down things I thought could be important. I saw a reoccurring symbol in a handful of the clips. It looked like an uppercase H with a cruelly drawn circle in the middle. A new reoccurring theme that would occasionally pop up. As I watched, I felt unnerved. At first, I thought it was from the more disturbing scenes that would occasionally happen, but it lingered even as I wandered my room while getting a drink. It felt like eyes were upon me, a thought implanted into my head from what I'd seen. But I wasn't wrong. I was being watched. My collectible memorabilia, the things I collected outside of VHS tapes, were in the room with me. Inane decoration for most of my life that now loomed in the corners with watchful eyes. I collected them all up in a box and stored them up in the attic, far enough away that I hoped they'd be out of sight, out of mind. But even with them in the house, I felt uneased. Though I couldn't bring myself to outright throw them away because they meant so much to me. My sense of unease never left. I found myself catching glimpses of myself in my mirrors, never seeing anything off, but feeling like something was amiss when I wasn't looking, doubting myself when it felt like my reflection was out of sync in the corners of my eyes as I turned away. I eventually caved in and boxed them up too, and left them in the attic in a box next to my collectibles. But it didn't help. Even without mirrors, I'd catch my reflection in the dark cola in my cup or the back of a clean spoon. But one I could never avoid was myself, looking back at me from the blacked out CRT screen after each episode ended, fervently denying anything off about my reflection. One more, I kept telling myself. One more and I'd be done. I just needed one more scene to satiate my curiosity. Even though I was reaching new levels of anxiety and stress, there was still an adrenaline rush of catching a scene that felt like I was progressing through this nightmare. I hit play. The camera showed a person trapped in a small room with walls that seemed to be closing in on them. The person tried to push against the walls, but the pressure was too strong. Strange whispers and screams echoed through the room. The person looked like they were on the verge of going insane. As the walls got closer and closer, the person started scratching at them, which were marred with the strange symbols from before. They looked like they were carved with a sharp blade, and they seemed to be pulsing with an otherworldly energy. Suddenly, I heard a clear, sinister voice above the whispers. "You can never leave," the voice said. "You're trapped here forever." The scene ended with the person realizing that there was no escape. Though I wondered if there was a hint of irony that the message could be about me. This wasn't what I wanted, so I hit play again. Next was the shot of a person entering a derelict house. The camera followed them as they explored the many rooms of this place. The air was thick with dust and cobwebs, and the only sound was the person's footsteps on the creaking floorboards. As he went deeper into the house, he stumbled upon a room filled with old dolls. The dolls seemed to be looking at the person with accusing eyes, and unease washed over the man's face. Suddenly, the dolls started to move on their own, their joints creaking as they turned their heads to look at the person. They seemed to be controlled by an unseen force, and the person realized too late that they were in danger. The scene ends with the person trying to flee the house, but the dolls seem to be blocking their escape, and the scene fades to black. The reoccurring themes of curiosity and danger was lost to me as I searched for what I could deem my last watch. All I could do was ignore my unmatched reflection on the black screen and keep hitting play. "One more time," I repeated again. "This will be the last one." A lie I tried to reaffirm myself with. The tape popped to life once more, but instead of a shot that could start a new narrative, it just lingered on an extremely uncomfortable zoom of an eye. The shot so grainy from the zoom and lighting that I couldn't make out the colour of the eye nor the shade of skin. It just stared. The only indication that it wasn't frozen was the occasional twitch of the eyelid, though it never blinked once. I could swear I saw something, what could be a clue, in the black of the pupil, a swirling movement that caught my attention, but it was too small on the screen for me to see from where I sat. So I stood up to get a closer look, and as soon as I did, it moved. The eye tilted slightly upwards and stayed in that new position. I didn't dare move in case I missed something, but it now lingered at this new angle in the same motions as before. So I slowly edged around my coffee table to get that closer look I wanted, trying to not let my eyes leave the screen for even a moment. And as I did, it moved once more. A slow bank to the right, exactly where I was moving. It watched me. I don't know how, nor did I want to entertain that idea, but it was tracking me like an animal tracks its prey. I froze at the realization, only to confirm my fears. It stopped too. I slowed my breathing, not knowing what to do, frozen like a deer in headlights, though at least the deer would sooner or later know what kind of danger it was in. I was completely in the dark. Eventually, an intrusive thought came to me, that if it really was watching me, that it was something I needed to stop as soon as possible. So I dove down to my coffee table and hit all the buttons on my remote, the eye snapping in the direction I moved as I did so. The screen cut black at the moment of interference, as it had before, and played out with a black screen until the end. I racked my brain trying to think of my next move as the machine clicked and started to rewind. But the scene was not long enough to give me pause for thought as it hit the start of the tape much too quickly and played automatically. The shot didn't give me the reprise of fading in. It cut instantly to a shot of my room, framed directly from the point of view from my TV. The brightness of the shot lighting me up enough to be visible in the screen, which seemed like a cinematic paradox I didn't even want to try to unpack. The fluorescent of the screen flickered with life enough for me to see myself frozen at the side of the coffee table, remote still in hand, and I was once again frozen in thought. All the while, none of the buttons were working to stop this nightmare I was now in. A new time limit was added as I stared at the screen. With the angle of the shot, plus the right amount of illumination, a glass pane on one of my units I used to display some of my more prized collectibles just caught my reflection in it. Something I didn't think the consequences of, until my reflection started moving, without my accompanied action. It slowly turned, fighting some unseen force that tried to pull it back to how it should be. All the while, movement caught my attention from my coffee table. My car keys had a keychain of a small rubber duck fashioned into a facsimile of a superhero. I heard the laboured plastic bend as its head tried to lean up to look at me. It seemed whatever moved the toys from the scene wasn't constrained to logical humanoid shapes. Looking back at the screen, against all odds, my reflected self managed to turn enough to face me through the screen and was trying to raise its hand like someone reaching towards a window pane, an idea that scared me into a fight response. I ran over to the TV and kicked it over with as much force as I could, something I felt needed as old CRTs have some hefty weight to them. It was enough to send it reeling back, and I used this opportunity like I'd somehow stunned the person by kicking their head and grabbed the VCR player from under the unit and ripped it out of its nest of wires. I ran all the way to the front door and, much to the behest of my confused neighbours, threw it out as hard as I could and slammed the door shut, lock slammed into place. I caught my breath, trying to suck back in my sanity with each gasp, hoping that I wouldn't suffer any of the fates of the many whom I'd witnessed over the many times I'd watched the tape. I locked the door to my collector's room, resigning it to a problem for future me. For then, I was content to letting the dust settle and paranoidly staying awake until sleep forced itself into me. Since then, I'd only been in that room once. The TV was still kicked over, the VHS tape shelves were unmoved, my couch was where it always sat, neatly where the indents of the feet had rested for the years since it was placed there. The VCR remote still scattered to the side from how it bounced off the coffee table when it fell. The cabinet was the last place I wanted to look. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, there was enough for me to know that this was real. The sweaty remains of a handprint pressed on the other side of the glass. Sure, I could say I might have done it myself from the last time it was opened many months ago, and I'd somehow forgotten to clean it, despite myself always keeping that glass crystal clear on a regular basis. But the symbol etched in the center of the palm was much too specific to explain away. I yet do not know if whatever ritual happened was far enough for something worse to happen, whether I stopped it in time or delayed the inevitable. The VCR was gone in the morning, and I hoped it was collected as refuse and left to rot in a dump somewhere. I can't imagine the demographic of a retro media collector had somehow thought they stumbled upon a new find, and that a neighbour took the hint that it was not worth salvaging from the condition I left it in as it cracked around on the concrete outside. I've since boxed up all my tapes and disposed of them. So many great memories, many of which were unique, now gone. All my childhood toys and memorabilia from that era gone too, along with anything reflective enough to see a shape myself in. For things I couldn't move, like my bathtub or windows, I simply coated them with a matte finish spray. I don't have a profound message to tell. Just don't be stupid. It'd be wrong to say I don't like kids. It's adults I have more of a problem with. In my last school, when I called one of the 10-year-old boys in my class a little asshole, he wasn't the problem. His parents are the ones who insisted I get fired. But that boy didn't mind me swearing at him, because he knew damn well he'd keyed my car, even if I had no proof. He just thought it was funny. No different to the sort of interaction he'd have with an older sibling. On that note, I wouldn't say I like children either. Kids are little adults. They're more truthful, but only because the stakes are lower. People with jobs and mortgages tell great big tremendous lies. Kids don't have the weight of the world on their shoulders, so why lie about mistresses and promotions and why you've been crushing up antibiotics into your wife's morning smoothie? Instead, they just lie about where their homework is. The kids I teach are right on the cusp of it. Some of the boys might get caught giggling at the back or showing each other naughty little videos they don't understand but can't look away from. But then they go out and chase each other around, do cartwheels, play tag, hide and seek, cry if they take a particularly bad knock. Kids are weird. Got one whose dad is in jail, and he talks about it like it means nothing. His old man tried to kick a woman to death in the parking lot of a bar and won't be out until the boy's a teenager. Kid don't care, doesn't get it. If anything, he thinks it's funny. But then last week, I confiscated his novelty pencil that was the size of a cucumber, and he screamed so hard he threw up all over the speckled tile that have been glued to the floor since '96. 10 is a weird age. Old enough to feel the vaguest hint of life's problems just beneath the surface like lumps in a pillow. To question why mommy downs 3 bottles of wine on a Tuesday, or why daddy changes his shirt and hides it in the garage before coming in from work. But too young to know what's really under the surface. These kids can feel something is wrong with the world. They just don't know what. Not yet, anyway. They have my sympathy. 26 years of teaching has eroded most of everything else. I'm not particularly invested in whether these little turds become scientists or janitors, nor am I particularly interested in helping them process their emotional luggage. If any of you want me to undo the damage you've done to your own kids, then you can start by paying me a hell of a lot more. But I do feel sorry for them, because they don't really know what's going on. But unlike a 5-year-old, they can't just fumble around in blind ignorance. They're stuck in between worlds, one where you cry yourself to sleep at night over your parents' divorce, but still think Santa and the Tooth Fairy are real. Maybe it's different at a rich school, one where kids don't go to food banks, or where whole families don't have to share a smartphone. I doubt it. Don't know why. I just doubt anyone's out there living the plot of the Bernstein Bears, rich or otherwise. I used to dream of teaching at one of the big schools a couple of towns over, the ones with all the funding. Oh, that'd be nice. Walking into a building that doesn't look like a set dressing for the next season of True Detective. Now I just dream of getting out of this profession entirely. Maybe if I play my cards right. Sounds crazy to say out loud, so I won't. But maybe I found a way out. Well, to be exact, the kids found it. Don't know what they got? Of course they don't. They're kids. They haven't a clue. But I think I'm maybe 13 weeks from another go. And when that happens, you can bet your ass I'm asking for a ticket out of here. At first, I planned on getting a cushy job in one of the schools a few towns over. One where the school bus doesn't have to plan its route around multiple trailer parks. Now I realize I was thinking small. If I'm smart, I won't ever have to work another day in my life. Imagine that. 13 more weeks. Right now, Grenwig is with Layla. Sweet girl, but she's smart enough for it to be a problem. The dumb ones fare the best. You wake up to something grinning at you at your bedroom window. It helps to have a sort of mind that doesn't ask questions about what floor you're living on. Layla isn't winning a genius grant anytime soon, but I can tell it's bothering her, because deep down, she knows how wrong this all is. Dark circles under the eyes, pallid skin, eyes that keep darting to the corners. Sometimes she falls asleep at her desk. Sometimes she wakes up with a little jump, like something only she can see has startled her. It's hard. Only reason she sticks it out is the same reason you or I would. The rewards. She got a smartphone last time. I wonder what it'll be this time. These kids don't ask for a lot. Toys mainly. One of them got crazy good at football real quick. That makes sense. But it's that kind of thing, you know. They don't ask for the lottery or nothing like that, because money's a little too abstract right now. Strange thing though, as young and naive as they are, they learn the rules pretty quickly. I guess Grenwig's lessons aren't subtle. Just look at one of my former students, Jared. Now at the time, all this flew under my radar. Kid in my class lost a parent, moved away. So what? Things happen. Turns out, he asked for his father to get sober. Next day, the poor guy got caught in the machinery at his job. CCTV footage was very popular in live leaks. Makes for grim viewing. I'm not particularly handy, so I never knew a lathe could do that to a human body. Anyway, it's not good to ask things for other people. I wish my dad was this. I wish my mum was that. Oof. Alia told me that up front around the time I started asking why half the kids in my class had new iPhones and Nintendo Switches. She said it was easy to ask for things, but it was riskier to ask to change something into another thing, and downright awful to ask it to change a person in any way, no matter how small. Even that kid who got good at football played a risky game. It paid off, but the other kids wouldn't go near him for a week. They kept expecting something bad to happen to him, and they didn't want to be in the splash zone. I can't pretend to understand the subtleties. Like the kids, I can only observe what happens to other people and learn the lessons that imparts. Nothing about Grenwig is guaranteed. There are no certainties. Even the kids get worn down by it. Whoever has it, they're a pariah. Risk assessment in under 11s. Strange thing to see. But unless it's your turn, you don't even want to risk something as inane as a game of catch with his chosen friend. Grenwig is territorial, possessive, bizarre. Didn't even believe it. Until it was somehow my turn, which the kids found pretty alarming. Grenwig doesn't like adults. I thought it was a ghost at first. Lights coming on and off, footsteps in the corridor outside my apartment. Pretty creepy, sharing my home with something I couldn't see. I didn't like it, but it had only been a couple of nights, and I did a good job of convincing myself there was no ghost or poltergeist. just an overactive imagination. Yeah, sure, the TV changed, and there were finger marks on my bathroom window I hadn't put there. So what? Way at the back of my mind, I'd reserved a little bit of space for the possibility of a haunting, but otherwise, I remained a skeptic. Jesus, if only it was as simple as a haunting. I don't know if I could explain to you how it felt the first time I woke up to Grenwig gently stroking my toes. The violation of it, the feeling of a world that didn't make sense. My eyes glared at his fingers, terrified, heart pounding, head throbbing like I'd taken a knock, and I kept waiting for it to make sense. My eyes wandered, tried to find the hands those fingers belonged to, but they just kept going, and going, and going. They stretched for meters until they disappeared into the shadow of my closet. Whole time, they kept massaging the big toe, cold as ice. I started counting the knuckles. I got to 13 and gave up. But they were fingers. I could tell from the nails. The hair that ran along the dimpled skin the color of cement. And then, just as I started to really appreciate that I was awake, 100% stone cold sober and lucid, and what I was seeing wasn't a dream or a nightmare or some other conjuration of the mind. Just as I felt panic begin to flare up inside my chest like a burgeoning heart attack, those impossible fingers withdrew into the darkness like a spider curling its legs. I got up and threw on the lights. I found my closet empty. Felt the world was coming apart. Had to be a night terror, I decided. Hadn't had one for decades, but what else could it be? I wanted to go back to sleep, to at least try. But I was so scared I couldn't face the dark again. So I decided to stay up. Went out into the living room and turned the TV on, plopped down on the sofa and let my head tilt back. I might have drifted off again. I don't know for sure. All I remember was the feeling as the cushion beneath me adjusted. And I heard it. The sound of something tightening, like a creaking door. I looked down and saw white bands wrapped around the entirety of the sofa. Fingers. They tightened, and the material let out a groan as the tension went up a notch. I flew upwards in a terrible panic. By the time I turned back, the fingers were gone, but the indent they'd left on the sofa remained. This repeated itself all night. Each time I felt close to drifting off, those impossibly long fingers would reach out of the darkness somewhere and make an appearance. They knocked glasses off countertops, opened the fridge, turned on the oven, and, whenever possible, they touched me, stroked an ear, tickled my nose, slid between my fingers and tried to hold my hand. I tried to play chicken with it at least once. I stayed stock still as a greasy finger plucked at my lips and tried to find its way into my mouth. But before it met any success, I flipped out and ran shrieking into the corridor outside my apartment. Panting in the hallway, I told myself I'd never step foot in that apartment. But there was something about the way all my neighbors came to their doors one by one and just stared at me in my underwear and sweat-stained vest. I felt like a damn idiot before I knew it. I was offering muddled apologies while slinking through my front door. By the time I got to school the next day, I felt like I was teetering on the edge of a breakdown. I genuinely suspected my day was going to end with me being carted off in a straitjacket. Last people I expected to find any understanding from were my students. But when I came in looking like a sleep-deprived drunk, they all stared at me in silence. And this wasn't the slack-jawed idiocy I'm sometimes used to with these kids. Like that time I told them I used to have a wife. This was something else. Took me a second to decipher it. Not the sort of expression I'm used to from that age group. With half of them being miniature psychopaths. It was sympathy. They felt sorry for me. But when I took a step forward, every single one of them scooted their chairs backwards. Just like that, it clicked. I spent the last year watching them take turns ostracizing one another, and I'd just written it off as just a peculiar product of childhood social dynamics. It felt cruel, and I tried over and over to mitigate it. To sit with the excluded kids and talk with them, try to figure it all out. But it was an enigma, all of it. If it wasn't for the fact that this messed up system seemed to operate on a kind of rota, I would have been forced to intervene. But as it was, the kid who was targeted would always be back with the crowd a week later, and they'd be the ones excluding someone else. But now all of that made sense. The way they were looking at me. Pity, recognition. They knew what I'd spent the night going through, and for the last year, they'd gone through it themselves, one by one. "You should play with Grenwick, sir," one of the quieter girls piped up, looking wide-eyed like a hostage at gunpoint, and all the other kids nodded. "Yeah, he wants to play. You need to play with him. He gets real impatient." A chorus of whispered ahas. "Grenwig?" I muttered. One word. Is that what it's called, I wondered? And all the other kids nodded, like they could read my mind. There are no records of Grenwig anywhere, by the way. Good God, I tried 1,000 times over to find something. Anything. The best I could think of was that Grenwig was a kind of boogeyman. But what does that even mean? Just a word used to give the world a little more shape, a little more structure. I'm not sure Grenwich has much of either. The games he plays are like what a toddler or a young dog would be interested in. Basic stuff, no rules. I move something, Grenwig moves it back. Hours lost tracing the spiral of my hair, or pulling at my cheeks and face to create strange new expressions, or flicking the lights on and off. During that time, I took to eating lunch in my car, largely because it was hard to be around people who couldn't see why a glass went flying at the wall, or why I had to keep stacking plates until they were so tall they toppled over. At least the kids gave me a heads up. Most important warning I ever got in my life. Every kid had their own observations, some more relatable than others. Most of them boiled down to the simple fact that for 7 days, you belonged to Grenwig. You were a toy, a source of endless amusement for something that had the sense of humor of a 3-year-old. Pretty much every kid agreed on one concrete thing though. Saying no to Grenwig was dangerous. Now, I can't say for sure, but I'm positive Grenwig gave the kids more leeway. He left them alone for lunch and dinner. Bedtime games were usually quieter. But for me, it was almost like part of the game was watching me go about my adult life as he did everything to mess with me. He'd snatch at my steering wheel, giggling from the dark footwell, yellow eyes peering up from between my legs. He'd grab my phone and throw it into the middle of traffic, or sit there tickling my neck and armpits as the principal demanded to know why my class's behaviour was so erratic. He made it difficult, pushed me right up to breaking point. Eventually, I snapped. I slapped his hand away as he tried to mess with me during a traffic stop. Felt like screaming at him that he was this close to getting me shot. But of course, I couldn't. Just had to sit there as this cop looked over my license and mulled giving me a sobriety test. Couldn't blame him. I'd been swerving all over the road until I saw the flashing lights. Didn't help when, as he approached my pulled over car, he saw me slapping furiously at the steering wheel, hissing, "Stop it," over and over. He inevitably issued the test, which I passed. The cop gave me a long, narrow-eyed stare before telling me to go get some sleep. He must have figured I was just a stressed mental case instead of a drunk, and he was right. It was day 6, and I'd barely slept. Despite all the grave warnings from the kids about the dangers of telling Grenwig off, I drove off hoping that maybe he would just let this one go. I went to school and taught lessons as usual. But Grenwig made no appearances. I asked the kids if his little rota ever found itself wrapping up a day early, and they all shook their heads, like they knew bad news was coming my way. But none of them wanted to say for sure. Still, it was my first time, so I ignored the look in their eyes and tried my best to focus on the hope that maybe Grenwig was going to finally leave me alone. A feeling that dissolved in its entirety when I opened my front door and found a package on the floor. A large box about 1 foot cubed. It looked like old cardboard, like what happens when it gets soaked but left out to dry. Just dingy. Its sides had been stapled together too, and that gave it a real homemade look that went the extra creepy little mile. I expected something bad. I knew the second when I went to lift it, and it was too heavy, that something was wrong. It just felt like lifting an overfull bucket from the bottom. And then there was the smell, and the noise that sounded like a distant transmission of a mewing child. Tinny, like the muffled cries of someone on the other side of a very thick wall. When I finally opened it, I found the policeman inside. Familiar because of the shield and name. He'd been folded, I guess is the best way I can describe it. At first, I thought it was just his uniform. But, clothes aren't warm, and obviously a folded uniform wouldn't explain the forearm hair and skin poking out the side. I recoiled, terrified, fell backwards onto my ass, and this was when Grenwig made his appearance. His arachnid fingers curled out from the box. I'd say about a dozen of them this time. There are always more in the dark, out of sight, and these did what I couldn't have brought myself to do on my own. They enfolded the policeman, lifted him up like a tailor showing off a suit, and the flayed skin opened up to reveal the barely recognizable outline of an adult man. He was still alive, and the rest of him, I soon found out, was in my bathtub. And that half was also very much alive, thrashing and sliding as it struggled to gain a grip on the smooth ceramic, begging for its other half. Words I don't really think were a natural fit for the stern man who'd interrogated me just 10 hours ago. But then again, it wasn't really the same man. Either way, he spoke of the darkness between atoms, the infinite space where time doesn't exist, and the endless shapes that swim the murky abyss, fleeing their cruel god. More than that, he lamented no longer being whole, feeling himself in 2 places at once. He called it wrong, and on that, he had my agreement. I begged Grenwig to take it away, to undo what he had done. And that was how I used my first favour. The box and the man disappeared, dragged off to some dark corner that was out of sight. And that was the last I saw of him. Although a bit of research later on revealed that while Grenwick did indeed put him back together, the poor man has been catatonic in a hospital bed ever since. Alive, but definitely not well. The next day, the kids asked me what I'd requested. I told them I asked for a new PlayStation. Didn't tell them the truth, partially because it would traumatize them, but partially because acknowledging it even happened would traumatize me. After that, I crunched the numbers. I figured out the number of kids and how often the rota would fall on me. Based on this info, I booked the week off ahead of time. And, well, I just waited. I tried to support the kids as best I could when it was their turn, but they didn't really have the same problems as me. I mean, it wasn't a holiday for them either. Each one came to school looking like they'd spent the night watching their dog die over and over. Just distraught, ruined, exhausted. But like I said, Grenwick generally let them eat their food or interact with their parents and siblings without demanding attention at the worst possible time. Eventually, round 2 came along. The kids seemed damned relieved. As for Grenwick's games, this time I came prepared. I'd already noticed that Grenwick only ever emerged from the shadows, and the kids corroborated that fact. So in the run up to my turn, I spent the week setting up my bathroom with as many lamps and torches as I could find. It wasn't easy to eliminate all those shadows. I had a lot of sleepless nights trialing different arrangements, but eventually I got one as close to perfect as I could. I figured if I could just have 1 or 2 nights of sleep, it'd be damn easier to deal with. An hour passed before my stomach began to ache. By the time I realized what Grenwick was doing, I could already feel the urge to throw up. Guess I hadn't given him much of a choice. He wanted to play, and there was only one place in that room that was still dark. It wasn't until I threw myself out into the living room and switched off all the lights that the pain eased up. By then, I was already close to suffocating on the finger sticking out of my throat. When it finally withdrew and I took my first breath in over a minute, I collapsed to the floor, unable to do much of anything except heave and sob. Grenwick, yellow eyes glaring at me from the space between my sofa, giggled. In hindsight, I'm lucky he found it funny. I think he thought it was a game of sorts. God knows what would have happened if that little stunt had made him mad. Otherwise, that second round passed without incident. At least I wasn't at work. It was hell, but I didn't have to worry about driving anywhere or being out in public waiting for those wretched hands to find me. I just stayed indoors and played his weird little games, which mainly just involved me cleaning up whatever stupid thing he decided to make a mess of. I found it helped if I played up my exasperation. The less I reacted to his mischief, the more likely he'd escalate. When it was all over, I asked for a winning lottery ticket. Unfortunately, I didn't specify the amount, which I suppose is my fault. At least the amount I won covered rent that month, even if my expectations were a little higher. Still, I figured it'd be better next time. I'd be more specific, I decided. Best laid plans of mice and men. You ever lost someone? Most people have. I have for sure. More than once too. It nearly unmade me, and I was a fully grown man. It was about a couple days before my turn that Alia experienced the first loss. Most kids, it's a hamster. If they're unlucky, a grandparent. For her, it was her older brother. I taught him 11 years earlier, and he was a good kid. Smart like her. Went on to become a mechanic. His passing wasn't anything strange or sinister. Just an accident. Jack popped off. Car crushed him. Random. Devastating. She was called out of a lesson by the principal and her parents. The three of them looking like hell. Like they'd spent a month one-on-one with Grenwig. A little reminder that not all nightmares hide in the dark, I suppose. I don't know why this hit me hard. I think it was probably my own experience with grief. Either way, it stuck with me. Her absence, the empty chair and desk, felt hard to ignore day after day, knowing what she was going through. I think it's one thing to accept that these kids will face circumstance, poverty, bad parents, life isn't fair. I don't get a say in the way society says some kids get ponies and others get rickets. But there's something about losing someone that way. Just a random confluence of bad luck that hits harder than most. I don't know if I can explain it. It's just Alia was already grown up at the bottom rung of our not very invisible class system. Hadn't she had a fair share of bad luck already? I mean, damn, even Grenwig grants favours. Even that wretched monster isn't all bad. But an accident like what happened to Alia's brother, there's no upside. It's just a mess. Thing is, like I said, my turn was coming up. And I mean, the way I saw it, the boy was already dead, right? It wasn't like he could die getting wrapped up 3 times around a lathe. Worse that already come to pass. I decided to do something that even at the time I figured to be pretty stupid. But if there was a chance it could work, well, I had to try. Round 3 with Grenwig went real easy. I preemptively bought a bunch of jigsaws and left them half done. He honed in on them straight away. I did as much as I could in a single sitting, turned around, turned back, and he'd muddled them all up. I'd play up my anger and irritation, then go back to it. Drank a lot of coffee and whiskey, watched a lot of movies. Grenwig loved it. Broke a couple plates and mugs too. It wasn't all plain sailing. Woke up one night to find him licking my neck and had to rush to the hospital to get the chemical burn treated. Still, for the most part, the week went by without much incident because, well, I had something in mind. Couldn't get it out. This idea, I had to act on it. And the promise of what it would mean if it worked meant I practically skated through the week with a smile on my face. At least I had the sense to specify the boy returned to me, not Alia. I thought if anything went wrong, it'd be best if she didn't have to see it. It was 4 in the morning when I was awoken by a sound that had slipped into my dreams as a kind of creaking door. But as I opened my eyes and reality reasserted itself, I realized that what I was actually hearing was a little more gravel being trod on. Strange, distant, quiet. I held my breath, if only so that I could hear better. But it seemed to only amp up the sound of blood rushing through my ears. White noise. It's so hard to perceive what's there sometimes, isn't it? All I wanted was for my ears or eyes to report something useful to me without having to get out of the safety of my own bed. Instead, all I got were dim shadows and the sea-like susurrations of my own breathing. At least I could ascertain I wasn't alone in my apartment. Over time, the longer I waited, the more sure of that I became. Something was out there, in the corridor between my bedroom and the living room at a guess, moving with a kind of irregular rhythm that belongs only to living things. This wasn't the wind or some pipe settling. Something was moving, and it was moving in my direction. Low to the ground, a noise I couldn't put any shape to. Wrong, all wrong. Made me think of breaking pencils, grinding teeth. In the end, I couldn't help myself. I got up and called out, "Who's there?" The words didn't feel real to me. The world took on a realer-than-real distortion that comes with terror, coupled with a prickling white heat at the nape of the neck. For a moment, I swore I was outside my own body, staring down at myself from above. It was too much. But that sound was clearer than ever before. There was no pretending this ghost wasn't real. I turned on the light. Alia's brother screamed and crawled away from the light. Neglected whimpers left behind like a trail that led me to the living room, where I found him curled around a table leg. He was alive, but not whole. Guess I hadn't given much thought to what a car would do to a man's chest. Every breath was a strange orchestra. Too many sounds to disentangle. Bone on bone, crumbled ribs expanding, or at least trying to, and drawing oxygen into blood-filled lungs. Moss had grown across his face, even in the short time he'd been in the ground. A hand, ice cold, shot out and grabbed my wrist and cried out, but he didn't let go. He followed as I tried to push myself away, his bottom half trailing along, limp and misaligned with his torso. Felt like pulling a sack of meat across an ice rink. "Don't send me back," he whimpered. "Don't send me back." Eventually, my foot hit the sofa and I fell into it. He dragged himself using his hands over to the side so that we were face to face before I even had time to push myself upright. "He likes you," he whispered, and I recoiled at the smell of his breath. "There are so few things in the dark that know how to leave, but he does. Don't ask him to send me back, please." For the first time, my mind started working. Was he talking about Grenwick, I wondered. But of course, I told myself. Who else? What's over there?" I asked. He went to answer before the words choked in his mouth and his face twisted into a mask of melancholic agony. Trying to utter something, he burst into painful sobs. "Don't make me go back," was all he could manage to say. "Don't make me go back. Don't make me go back. Please, please don't send me back there. You don't know what they do to us." I don't know what to do," I stammered. The boy grabbed me and pulled me close, unsure of how to comfort him. I let him hold me in an embrace. "We aren't the same when it's done with us." "What?" I never saw him take the knife from the kitchen, but I suppose he'd been in my home for longer than I'd been awake, and he had plenty of opportunity. First thing I felt, which surprised me even in the moment, was that it suddenly became hard to breathe. That was the punctured lung. Felt like the worst pneumonia I'd ever had come over me in the space of 5 seconds. Just boom, suffocating on your own blood, so much that it spilled over my lips and down my chin. By the time I registered the aching waves of dull agony pulsing out of the spot on my ribcage, I was already slumping back down onto the sofa, sitting there like I was getting ready for a Friday night move. Not that I was helpless. I took maybe 2 seconds, tops, to accept what had happened, to understand it, and then I was able to drive my heel into his head as he tried to climb up onto me. Weirdly, his broken back helped him. He sort of just bent with the blow. But it didn't actually dislodge him. I had to kick him again to do that. And then I had to stand up and do it again and again. And I think around the 4th or 5th kick, I realized I had something of a problem. The pain didn't really bother him. Not when I kicked him in his pulped chest, not when I stamped on his hand as he tried to push himself back up for the 10th time, not even when I rolled him over and stamped on his head, struggling to aim my foot through the tears in my eyes, even as I'd immobilized him, even as I fumbled around and found an old bike helmet and clubbed his skull until my arm grew sore. He didn't cry out in pain. He just kept trying to get back up. "Damn!" I screamed as seconds turned to minutes, which just kept ticking on. I felt like I was swinging for hours, but in truth, I don't know how long. Eventually, I stopped for breath and frantically looked from one corner of the room to another, desperate for the first time in my life to see those horrible long fingers. "Take him," I cried. "For God's sake, take him back." I suspected he'd been waiting and watching, because with very little delay, Grenwig finally made his appearance. Yellow eyes clustered together like frog spawn, winked at me from a shadow under the table. They seemed self-satisfied, as they always did. But I didn't care. The mutilated man who lay on the floor continued to bark with wet laughter, pouring at me with broken fingers. I was feeling faint, and my whole right side was burning hot and cold all at once as warm blood began to pool. "Oh God," I cried. "Just take him back." Grenwig's hands wasted little time, and that man's laughter grew only more hysterical as the fingers wrapped around his chest and legs and slowly towed him towards the dark. I felt a brief moment of relief as I hoped this would be the end of my mistake. But then, I felt his arms wrap around my legs. Even broken, his strength was something special. Trapped in a bear hug, slowly being pulled toward that abyssal shadow, I began to panic. But it was far too little and far too late. I went feet first, a feeling like nothing else I'd ever had. In the end, I was clinging by the tips of my fingers to an impossible ledge. Above me was a sort of opening with no defined beginning or end, and on the other side laid my living room. I looked down, and for the first time saw Grenwig as a whole. In hindsight, it had been a mistake to think of him as humanoid. I think I just decided the boogeyman should look like a man. But what floated in the strange ether beneath me was more akin to a jellyfish, or maybe a spider. I don't know. It was dark in that void, and yet impossibly clear. I could see things in there, more than just Grenwig. It defied dimensions as we understand it. It was both an ocean and a landscape. In the distance, leviathans swam through open space. I'm not even sure I was seeing based on light. When I blinked, I still saw everything. Grenwig found it all hilarious. He had a mouth, and it laughed maniacally as it peeled Alia's brother from around my waist, leaving me free to kick and pull my way back into reality. As I slid onto the carpet of my living room, his laughter persisted. As soon as I was out, I crawled and rushed to the bathroom where I locked the door and passed out. Grenwick's next term with me lasted 2 weeks, which I think was because I made 2 requests, one for Alia's brother to return from the dead, and the other for him to be taken away. Either way, I didn't begrudge Grenwick's games, but it did mean I didn't get another request. I have to wait until next time. Meanwhile, I've watched the children approach the end of the school year, and I find myself wondering if they'll age their way out of Grenwick or take him with them to the next teacher's class. If he leaves them alone, will he terrorize the next lot of kids I teach? Either way, I think Grenwick will let me double up again. And that's important, because if so, I know what I'm going to do. Like I said before, I'm out of here. No more teaching. I'm cashing out. But I've decided, after what I did to Alia and her brother, that I can at least take Grenwick with me. He can become a permanent friend. Leave the kids the hell alone. I don't want him following them or haunting the next bunch to come along. I'm going to stuff my pockets so full of cash that I can build him and me a playground, and he won't ever have to bother them again. They have enough to deal with. I worked as a social worker for 12 years out on the East Coast. I saw children who were mistreated, women that were abused, and plenty of others that had mental health problems, bad judgment, or worse luck. So many people suffering, and you get invested and try to help, and then have to leave it at the job so it doesn't eat you alive when you go. And, for the most part, I was good at compartmentalizing that stuff. But then, 5 months before I quit and moved across the country, I met a young, traumatized woman. And everything changed. Her name was Hattie McGovern, and she was a college student who had been attacked the night before as she crossed through a park on the way to a neighborhood. When I saw her, she was on the first day of 3 days of observation. She had injuries, sure, but they were largely cuts and abrasions to her scalp. And what she was saying didn't entirely make sense. When we were alone and I was finished telling her about the government services she might benefit from, I asked her if she wanted to talk about what happened. I'd heard enough from the nurse outside to know it would be wild, but I had no idea of the details until she began to speak in a soft, hoarse voice. She said she'd been halfway through the park, walking at a fast pace because she planned on taking a shower and then heading back out to meet some friends, and was running behind. When she realized an older man was walking next to her. Well, not next to her, she said, about 50 feet away, traveling across the grass, stepping over hedges and sidewalks without slowing or even looking at where he was going. Instead, he was just keeping pace with her, step for step, and staring at her with a wide smile that made him look like a skull between his pale skin and his bald head. This freaked her out, of course, and she began walking faster. She didn't run, she said, because she felt like it was kind of like running from a bear. You shouldn't show weakness or fear, but just get away before things went from weird to bad. So she turned to look to where she was going and to see if she saw any people closer than her apartment complex a block away. There was none, and when she looked back to where the man had been, he was gone. That's when she felt a hand plunging into her long, blonde hair and pulling her to the ground. I'd known it was going to be something about her hair. Her injuries, other than a bruise on her throat and a couple of other scrapes, were all on her head. dozens of oozing places where the strange bald man had held her down and roughly cut off all her hair with a straight razor. Crying softly, she showed me a picture of her the week before. Long, curly hair the colour of summer honey framed her then smiling face. A past her that didn't know what was about to happen. The version of her before me looked 10 years older and broken in some fundamental way. Sniffing back tears, she said that when the man yanked her to the ground, the breath went out of her, but she immediately started trying to get up and get away, that he had grabbed her by the throat and held her back down, but just for a moment, just long enough that he could spit in her face. Hattie said it made no sense, but after he did that, she couldn't move anymore, not at all. The girl told me the doctors had tried to say it was shock or fear, but she said that was nonsense. She was paralysed by the thick, foul-smelling wad he'd spat onto her face, and even him producing the straight razor from a hidden pocket didn't get her moving again beyond the hammering of her heart. He never said anything, just smiled as he began gripping handfuls of her hair and scraping them off her scalp. I asked her if it hurt, and she gave me a watery laugh. She said that sure, it did, but that wasn't the worst part. It was feeling so violated and having a part of her taken away. Even more than the fear of what he might do to her after, that feeling had been the worst. When he had rolled her over to her stomach to cut the rest of her hair off, she felt the first tingles of movement starting to come back. Not enough to really move, but some small stirring twitches. She decided to wait, let it come back more, and then try to run when the opportunity came or he was distracted. Not that she was just sitting and waiting for him to do whatever he wanted. Every moment she was tensed to try and fight if she saw the blade coming for her neck or if he tried to take her clothes off. She just knew that she couldn't really move or fight yet, and she wanted him to either go slow or just stop and leave her alone. He chose the latter. When he had cut off the last of her hair, he scooped up the pile next to her head and walked a few feet away out of her line of sight. She heard some kind of gasping, choking sound then, and while it took all her strength, she managed to turn her head slightly to see what he was doing. He was eating her hair. All of it. Golden fistfuls were crammed in, one after the other, as he chewed and gasped and choked and swallowed. The sound was disgusting, but seeing it was worse. She said it scared her worse than before, though she couldn't have said why. And it was then, as she lay frozen and horrified, that the man suddenly let out a gasping groan and toppled over onto the grass. He lay there, twitching for what felt like a minute or two, and though from her angle she couldn't see his face, she felt like he was either having a seizure or choking to death. She hoped for the latter, but didn't dare rely on that. Forcing her limbs to move, she got to her hands and knees and started to crawl out to the street. Everything felt weird and slow, but she started making progress, periodically looking back to see if the man was still out. First time, still down and twitching. Second time, he was sitting up and staring at her. It was at this point that she started shaking and crying harder. So, after waiting a couple of minutes, I asked the question to prompt her. Did he come for her again? No, she said. They looked at each other. He gave her another smile, and she started crawling faster while screaming her head off. A guy was jogging down the other side of the street and came over to help. When she looked back the next time, her attacker was gone. "Thank God," I said, and she nodded in mute agreement. But I could tell there was something more. When I asked, she paused a long time before shaking her head. "You'll just think I'm a crazy liar like they do." I had to reassure her that I wouldn't think any such thing several times before she finally told me the rest. "When he sat up, when I saw him that last time, he wasn't bald anymore. He had long, curly hair, blonde hair, just like mine. He ate my hair and stole it from me." Over the next couple of months, I checked on her case. Hattie had moved back to Wisconsin to be with her family, and while her physical wounds were healing well enough, she still had emotional issues she was working through from the attack. When I called her mental health counselor at a new college, she tried to talk very broadly and not give me any details. But toward the end of the conversation, she did let one slip. "The poor dear. It's so strange how her hair won't grow back." It was another month and a half before I saw the graffiti. I normally took a bus home to just 2 blocks from my work, but one day my normal bus line was delayed due to an accident, so I had the choice of paying for a taxi or walking further to a different stop. I picked the latter, and while the neighborhood I traveled through didn't seem especially rough or dangerous, it was more run down than the places I worked or lived. More closed businesses and unkempt lots, and graffiti scattered along the walls here and there. It was when I was nearing the bus stop that I had to walk under an overpass bridge that had colourful drawings and sayings, insults and boasts. Yet, among that riot of lines and squiggles, one thing stood apart, as though none of the rest wanted to be close to this single line written in simple letters of dark red. "He only eats the best of us." A year earlier, I would have laughed at the line, wondering if it was a social commentary or a line from a movie. But walking through that patch of shadows as the words burned down at me from above, my mind immediately went to Hattie, and I walked faster until I reached my stop. When I reached it, I looked back, and that's when I saw him. A thin, pale man with long, flowing, blonde hair. I might have let out a little scream right then, I don't remember. I do recall turning back to the street, thinking I needed to call a taxi or get someone's attention. When I saw the bus turning the corner a block down, and I nearly cried in relief. Running to meet it, I jumped on as soon as the doors opened, and when I looked back, I saw no sign of the man anywhere. Heart pounding, I scanned my pass and took a seat in the middle of the bus. It was only half full, but the comfort of being around other people, even total strangers, was undeniable. I felt like a gazelle hiding in the herd from a stalking lion. The dramatic flair of the thought made me laugh. Wasn't I overreacting? Had I really seen the man, or had I just imagined it because I was tired and taking a strange route that made me uneasy? Glancing at my phone, I guessed my nearest stop to home would be about 20 minutes away. After a moment's debate, I set my phone alarm for 15 in case I dozed off, though that seemed unlikely given the panic I'd felt a few moments before. I might not ever sleep. I woke up to words being spoken right next to my ear. "You have lovely eyes." I jumped in my seat and started to turn around when I froze. The evening had fully come on by now, and the windows of the bus were all black with the growing night outside. In the reflection of the window closest to me, I could not only see myself, but who had spoken to me. It was the old, blonde man, leaning against my ear like a whispering lover. In the reflection, my terrified gaze found his milky eyes, hanging like infected moons above his sickly, sickle smile. He held me with that look for a moment, before rasping out the words again. "You have lovely eyes." My fear broke the spell this time, and I jumped out of my seat and rushed to the front, yelling for the driver to let me out. Let me out now, goddammit. Looking surprised and irritated, he pulled to the curb even as my phone alarm went off. I was just 2 blocks away now, and I wasn't above running the entire way. So that's exactly what I did. I jumped off the bus as the doors opened, pulling off my heels and running barefoot down the sidewalk for 2 blocks to my building. I never looked back the entire time, and it wasn't until I was behind my door and the deadbolt was thrown that I took a breath or dared to look back out through the peephole. I saw no sign of anyone out there, and when I went to my windows to look for any sign of the old man following me, I found none. Good. It was maybe a coincidence, but even if it was Hattie's guy, he couldn't have followed me all the way home, not with how fast I was There was a knock at the door. Stifling another scream, I crept back to the door, not wanting to betray that I was home. Looking back through the peephole, I saw nothing. Maybe it had been a mistake, and the person had realized they had the wrong door and went on. I waited for a couple of minutes, watching and listening for someone, and there was nothing. It wasn't until I turned to go into the living room that a new knock returned. This one more rhythmic and familiar. Knock, 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 knock. I gave a shudder as I realized I recognized what that was. Shave and a haircut, 2 bits. Biting my lip, I went back to the door and stared out again through the hole. There was still no one out there that I could see. Not that I was about to open the door to fully check. What if they were just standing to the side, waiting for me to crack the door? I debated calling the police, but I wasn't sure what to tell them, or if they'd even come for something so small. So instead, I called the building's handyman, George. Told him I thought a creepy guy might have followed me into the building, and now someone kept knocking on my door. I asked him did he mind coming up and just see if he saw anything. He sounded sleepy and irritated initially, but when he heard the fear in my voice, he said he'd be right there. Less than 5 minutes later, there was a new knock on the door, but this time it was quickly followed by George's voice. "Miss Castillo, there's no one out here now. I'm going to double check the other doors, but I think you're okay. Someone did leave you something out here though." I unlocked the door and opened it part way. "Left something? What?" George pushed the item through the crack and handed it to me. "There. That's for you, I guess. I think you're okay. But you be careful, okay? There are some bad things out there." I noticed that he said things instead of people, but I let it pass. "George, is something wrong?" He looked a little paler as he forced a smile and shook his head, never raising his eyes to me. "No, I think everything is okay. Just keep your door locked okay? And let me know if you have any more trouble. I gotta get back downstairs." I thought about reminding him to check the other floors, but then he was gone. Shutting the door back and locking it, I decided it didn't matter. I had a feeling he wasn't going anywhere except down to his own apartment to turn his own deadbolt. That feeling only grew when I turned on the lights and looked more closely at what had been left for me. Maybe it had been a mocking threat or a warning, but I knew what it felt like. A promise. So, the next day I gave my notice and moved most of my stuff into an extended stay hotel. 3 weeks later, I was driving a moving truck across the country to my new home. The first thing I set out in my new house was the gift I got that night. I hate looking at it, but I need to see it, be reminded of it, like a head or heart full of scars or the red letters scrawled underneath a bridge. It warns me to never let my guard down, to never assume that the darkness has nothing but empty fear waiting for me in its depths. Even now, I can see it on my mantle, gleaming a dull grey. I think it's made of pewter, and it feels very heavy and old the few times I've been able to make myself touch it. Not that I need to anymore. I still see it when I close my eyes. A thick-handled metal spoon with a deep, round bowl that tapers to a sharp edge on the outer rim. Not by initial design, but by use of whetstone or a grinder. It's more of a razor now, hard and cold and bitingly thin, shaped for cutting and digging. And I know, without checking, that if someone were to stick it into my eye socket, they could slice through the lid and scoop out my eyeball like a bit of overripe melon. My hands are shaking as I tell you this. I can't quite look at the mantle any longer, so I look out the window instead. It's not dark yet, but the shadows are growing fatter with each passing morsel of the day. I force myself to keep looking into the deepening twilight, and some nights I even tell myself I'm not still afraid. But the whisper in my heart isn't of bravery or strength. It's the dreadful double thrum of the gazelle's heart looking out into the darkness. Not looking out of courage, but out of terror and necessity and weak, trembling hope. Hope that, when we look out into the darkness, nothing looks back or is drawing near. A few years ago, I was invited to a dinner party. It wasn't that fancy, just a few old friends reconnecting. People I hadn't seen since high school. Some of the people on that list were people I hadn't seen or heard of for years, so it'd be a nice opportunity to catch up. My wife couldn't come though, invites only. She didn't mind. I looked forward to it all week. I took out my old Tom Skog high school baseball cap and went through the guest list. There were a few names I recognized at the drop of a hat, and a few that I didn't. I figured some people had changed their names over the years. While it wasn't a proper reunion, more like a get-together of old friends, I still got the sense that there was something more to it. There was no anniversary coming up, so it sort of came out of nowhere. I got the impression that maybe something else was up, like a proposal or some other announcement. The big night took place on a Saturday, at a rented venture just outside of town, some old clubhouse. Nothing big or fancy, but enough to house the 8 partygoers that had pressed the "I will attend" button. I got there a bit early, dressed up in my favourite jacket, sporting the classic baseball cap. It smelled a bit like mildew, but what the hell. If there ever was a time to wear it, this was it. Rolling up to the house, the first person I ran into was the host herself, Jerry, short for Geraldine. She was the de facto head of the AV club back in high school. The elected president of the club was often missing or off doing their own thing, leaving Jerry to take care of the practicalities. If there was one person I'd bet on to arrange a night like this, it'd be her. She swept me up in a big hug, pulling a little on my baseball cap. "Oh, we're bringing out the big guns, huh?" She laughed. "Should have kept my club sweater. Gotta represent the Togs." The stupid name we used for the locals. It was still around. Over time, the others dropped in. Nellie, the overachiever, Ollie, or Ole, who was on the student council, Chris and Corey, the twins, Omar, who didn't move in until the final year, but instantly made himself part of the group. Finally, we just waited for Tess. It was getting late, so we figured she could catch up later. We had a couple of drinks and got snacking on some appetizers. Jerry had arranged for a catered meal. It didn't take long for us to fall back into our old roles, finding our way back to each other like we'd never left. There is a saying that the better you know someone, the less you need to talk to them. It really is true. It was just a matter of minutes before we were right back to where we left things all those years ago. But Tess was a no-show. I figured she'd run into some sort of last-minute issue, but Jerry wasn't convinced. If anything, Jerry was being a bit strange about it, avoidant. Halfway through the main course, Nellie checked her phone. She fell silent all of a sudden. It was hard to tell, since everyone else was laughing and chatting about, but I saw her lift her hand to her mouth, and her eyes stopped blinking. She'd seen something shocking. I gently elbowed Omar next to me, who noticed the same thing. Once the two of us quieted down, so did the others. It didn't take long for the entire table to notice. Nellie looked up at us. There's been an accident. I think Tess is not..." She sniffled, putting down her phone. She buried her face in her hands, trying her best to hold back the tears. Everyone picked up their phones, trying to see if what she'd said was true. Checking local news, social media, anything. But I kept my eyes on Jerry. She was unnaturally quiet about this. It didn't take long for the room to devolve. Nellie was openly weeping. Ole just went pale, staring into the wall. Chris and Corey started arguing about the details as they differed from one source to the next. Omar just shook his head over and over, trying to convince himself it wasn't true. But of course, it was. Turns out Tess had some kind of aneurysm earlier that day. Out like a light the moment she sat down in her car. Completely unavoidable and undetectable. It just took some time for people to notice, since it looked like someone just sitting in their car. But Jerry just sat there, sipping a wine. She didn't look at her phone, and she didn't join the conversation. There was a shake to her hand, like she was suddenly nervous. I wanted to pull her aside and ask her about it, but there was no space. People were talking over one another, calling out, demanding my attention. All the while, Jerry didn't move a muscle. Then, the power went out. It went completely dark. For a moment, all I could see were faces lit up by smartphone screens like ghastly apparitions. I joined in, and so did Jerry. The discussion just died as we all looked at one another. At some point, someone turned their phone towards the table, as if looking for something. As the light panned across the room, we all noticed, in unison, a shape. It was only there for a fraction of a second. Something tall, dark and spectral. Arms that reached all the way to the floor. Something sickly thin and black as oil. There was a shrill screech, like the cables inside the walls were burning, screaming for help. This high-pitched burn, something overloading, bathing the room in the smell of burnt plastic and gypsum. In the blink of an eye, the power returned, and with it, the dark disappeared. The room erupted. Nellie was on her feet, backing away from the table. Ollie crouched down. The twins just stood up, looking lost. Omar just froze, not knowing what to do. But my eyes landed on Jerry and what she was doing. She just sat there, staring at the space where the dark thing had stood. As the room fell silent, I caught her attention. "What's going on?" I wheezed. What was that?" Jerry shook her head. As the rest of the room turned their attention to her, she began stuttering. Her eyes shifted from one to the next, until she finally gave in. It's hard to explain." So now we got the real story. It started a couple of months ago. It started with a woman named Gwen. She had been an acquaintance at best, someone that most of the group hadn't interacted much with. She was part of another clique in a way, and there wasn't much crossover between the groups. She had suddenly passed, leaving some former classmates devastated. Tess had heard about it somewhere in a social peripheral. One post in particular had stood out. In one of the memorial comment sections, someone mentioned, "She knew this was coming. She'd seen the spectre of death. She told me, and I think she was at peace." After that, there'd been 2 more deaths, a man and a woman, both dropping dead within a month of one another. Again, vague hints to seeing something and a spectre. But this time, Tess knew them a little better. In fact, she talked to one of them just weeks ahead of their death. 2 things became apparent. 1, that they were being followed by something. And 2, that they knew their time was running short. By that 3rd death, Tess figured it was no longer a coincidence. Their old friends were dropping like flies. She reached out to Jerry to kind of get the gang together to talk about it. But only days ahead of the reunion, she'd started to see the spectre herself. "She wanted us to go ahead, with or without her," said Jerry. "She knew this would happen." "So, what does it mean?" Nellie asked. "We all saw it. Are we all next?" Jerry shook her head as the questions rained. "What the hell is that?" yelled Corey. "Were you going to tell us?" Chris joined in. Question after question after question. Finally, Jerry just slumped into a chair, still shaking her head. "I don't know," she repeated over and over. I just don't know." Ollie was the first to react. He headed for the door. "I'm getting the hell out of here," he yelled. "Screw this." The moment he opened the door, the power was cut again, My phone was glowing hot in my hand, overloaded by static electricity. All the illuminated faces flickered as our phones struggled to stay alive. In the vague flicker from one of our phone screens, I only caught a glimpse of it. A figure so tall we couldn't see the head as it loomed outside the door. An impossibly long arm reached in. Ollie just screamed, devolving into a series of ever-repeating no-no-nos, until he was silenced. It took longer for the lights to return now. When they did, Ollie was curled up on the floor like a dying bug, face frozen in surprise and horror. He was already pale as limestone, his eyes glazed over, a single tear in the corner of his frozen eye, dead as a doornail. The room erupted into panic. Jerry screamed at them to stop. The twins headed for the back door, only for the lights to go out again. I could hear a bulb pop from the fridge, and I could smell something burning. The scene played out as if through a strobe light, as light bulbs struggled to come back to life. Little snapshots of chaos burned into my retinas. Chris dropped immediately in the doorway. Corey made it all the way back to the dinner table before he collapsed, an impossibly long arm touching the back of his head. He fell haphazardly forward, breaking the two legs at the short end of the table. He pulled down most of the tablecloth, along with the plates and glasses. Carefully prepared mimosas and half-drunk wine bottles spilled onto the floor, mixing with froth and dust. He was dead before he hit the ground. Omar panicked, but Nellie managed to hold him back. Jerry was hiding in the corner. I was just standing there, like a deer in headlights, trying to remember how to breathe. I had never been the one with a fight-or-flight instinct, like a genetic thing. Nellie shook her head. "I have to do regular checkups for work," she said. "I got a clean bill." We went through a checklist of things, trying to figure out an answer to why us. It was the only thing we could do. Our phones were dead, and no one dared to leave. We just stood there, our thoughts running away from us at the speed of panic. It didn't make sense. We were different genders, backgrounds, ethnicities, and religions. We had different occupations, aspirations, hopes, and dreams. For all intents and purposes, we were wildly different people. The only thing tying us together was our association with one another and our shared time at Tomskog High. At one point, we'd all curled up against the walls. I hugged my knees close to my chest. I couldn't look at Jerry without my eyes crossing paths with Corey's body, curled up like a dead bug, fingers twisted and turned in a painful final expression. I opted to just not look at her, instead speaking generally to the room. "So, that's it then?" I said. "There's no reason. We're just screwed. We tried to leave, and we're screwed." "That can't be," said Omar. "Then why wait? Why not just kill us?" "None of this makes sense," muttered Nellie, shaking her head. "Why now?" That was a good question. We considered what had been going on in our lives lately. I mentioned moving into a new house with my wife, who'd started a new job as a realtor. Nellie talked about accepting a position in Minneapolis. Omar was moving to South Dakota to be with her sick mother. Jerry had been working remotely for a company in Dallas for years, and only recently they decided to enforce a return-to-office policy. There were no obvious patterns. Relationships, families, jobs. It all looked very different. Omar tried a different approach. "Maybe it's more practical," he said. "Maybe we have to leave as a group." "Why?" "I don't know. I don't even know what it is. So let's look at it rather than us. "Let's look at what it's doing," I said. "It's keeping us here. It wants us to be here. We're safe now, right?" We all looked around, as if to make a point. We were indeed safe, for now. But despite it all, no matter how much logic we tried to apply to it, I couldn't wrap my brain around what we'd been looking at. Some kind of otherworldly entity tearing through us without any kind of retaliation. Or maybe there was. Nellie argued that we should attack it. We'd seen it, so it was some kind of physical entity. It had a shape, a form. That in itself should mean that it could be destroyed. Slowly getting off the floor, we looked at what we had. A few broken table legs as clubs. Jerry figured we could try using salt, as it was supposed to have some sort of supernatural properties on non-worldly entities. Omar figured trying a cross wouldn't hurt. We armed ourselves to the best of our abilities, figuring we should try something as a group. If it really was a physical entity, that meant it was constrained by its own properties, meaning it couldn't catch all of us at once. So, instead of moving as a pile of pigs to the slaughter, we would spread out, scattering to the wind. It was risky, but it was all we got. Omar positioned himself by the front door with a table leg. Jerry got the back door with a frying pan. Nellie and I took windows on the opposite sides of the room. She armed with another table leg, while I used the roast pan as a shield and a kitchen knife. We reviewed the plan again. We would go on 5, heading in different directions. Once out, we would be calling for help. If confronted by the entity, we would be using what we had to force it back just enough to run. We hadn't seen it move much, so maybe it wasn't that fast. It was a risky, stupid plan, but we were desperate. Nellie counted down from 5. I held my hand on the window, watching the others follow suit. As the countdown continued, I could feel the strength in my arm wane, like everything in me just wanted not to run, but to crawl into a corner and just wait. And yet, the countdown reached 0. Nellie flung the window open, Omar kicked the front door open, Jerry pushed into the back door. And me. I realized my window was locked. The reaction was immediate and violent. Out of every window and every door, dozens of shade-like appendages appeared. Knife-sharp, bone-like fingers reached for us. The windows were blown apart by the pressure, covering my hand in 100 little cuts, shattered pieces of glass boring into my hair. I didn't fight. That instinct just wasn't there. I scrambled backwards, doing exactly what my instinct taught me to make myself as small and invisible as possible. Omar fought, Nellie too. Jerry actually managed to hit something. I could hear the thwunk of the frying pan, but it was quick. No screams. As the lights died, I saw Jerry's head being grasped as she was dragged outside. Her heart stopped before she even dropped the frying pan. Nellie got halfway across the room before they got to her, making her faceplant into the hardwood floor in a morbidly comical manner. An entire life snuffed out, ending with an embarrassing self-inflicted nothing. Omar just stood there as one of the things loomed over him. It reached for him, and he did nothing. It was calm, collected, even reverent in a way. But as what looked like a thumb approached his forehead, he started shaking his head. "No," he pleaded. "No, I can't. Not like this." And with that, he He fell to the floor, empty. They made no sound. Dozens upon dozens of spectres poured into the room, surrounding me. I wanted to scream, but my breath was stuck in my throat. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was so far from the world I knew that it started to feel like a bad dream. It simply couldn't be well and truly real. But feeling that cold hardwood floor against my cheek made me think differently. I looked up, only to see one of the spectres looming over me, so tall that its head cut through the ceiling. It reached for me, a thumb-like appendage reaching for my forehead. And in that moment, it spoke to me. Less of a voice, and more of a series of impressions. It's hard to explain. It showed me flashes of a life, me settling down with my wife, growing little blue sunflowers in the backyard, having kids, growing old and dying on a park bench near Frog Lake, never leaving the little Minnesota town where I'd grown up. A long, peaceful and uneventful life. Little spots of sunshine and joy along a grey path, one I'd willingly bind myself to. But then it showed me something else. A different world, full of dark shapes in an endless desert of black sand. There I wondered as another faceless thing, saying nothing, doing nothing. And there was no end. Burning hellscapes where my flesh was reforming as fast as it melted from my bones in a perpetual cycle of pain. In another place, I was stuck in an empty, starless void, where my being was spread among dying stars, eternally drifting. In another, I was floating on a sensationless ocean, staring up at a night sky where a single red eye the size of a moon stared back. I was a consciousness bound to stages of life I could never break free from. It was an invitation. They were asking me to stay here, there, and forever. That's what had killed the others. They had wanted to leave. I finally understood. I wasn't running, I wasn't leaving. I was staying in this town, while the others had been eager to settle elsewhere. But this invitation wasn't just about me, and the here and now. This was about an endless multitude of existences waiting to happen, one where an end was not promised. A perpetual me, bound to whatever form necessary, like them, like all of them. I could feel myself shaking my head into a no. I could feel my tongue licking the roof of my mouth, looking to push out that N. But I couldn't. I froze. "Yes," I cried. "Yes, of course." A cold thumb touched me, as if drawing an invisible mark across my forehead. And that was it. One by one, they left. They'd gained what they came for. A recruit. Someone to stay with them, to join their group at an unfathomable cost. The final one left with a breeze, knocking over my Tomskog High baseball cap. Home of the Togs. I just stood there, alone. Contorted remains of people I used to know littered the floor. Husks. The lights came back on, phones buzzing across the room, pings from missed calls and messages. But after all the notifications died down, all that was left was me, sobbing on the floor, doomed. You might have heard about all this, but in another way. They blamed it all on wine poisoning. There was a sham investigation. I think something around 2,000 bottles were recalled. Not a single soul believed my testimony, and my lawyer recommended me to retract my official statement as it would either send me to a madhouse or get me in legal trouble. Perjury, maybe. Instead, I said that I simply didn't drink any wine, that I had settled for a beer. That in itself was a lie, but everyone was willing to believe it. Perhaps they all knew there was more to it. Perhaps they didn't care. A few years down the line now, I have 2 daughters. I have a nice job. My wife and I get along well, caring for the house together. It is a good life, but I can't help but to get that nagging feeling that I've doomed myself, that there was something waiting for me that I can't come back from, that maybe, at the end of all this, I am the one getting the raw deal, and not the shriveled up corpses that I left behind in that clubhouse. They say that you never really leave the small town life, that it follows you through your life, one way or another. I never thought it'd be this literal. My name is Alex, and for the past 8 years, I've been a 911 dispatcher. I work tirelessly in a dimly lit room filled with glowing screens, buzzing equipment, and low chatter. Nearly every day, I sit at my station wearing a headset that connects me to the voices of those in need. Working as a dispatcher has changed me though. After handling countless emergency calls, you develop a certain level of emotional resilience. You have to. There's no room for panic or hesitation when someone's life is on the line. I've heard the fear in people's voices, the desperation, the terror. I've listened to their last words, sent help racing to the location, and done everything in my power to keep them calm until help arrives. It's a heavy burden to bear, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. Still though, it can get to you, leave you in a dour mindset at the end of a night spent drinking to forget some of the more unforgiving circumstances that you endure through the night. Life at the call center has become a sort of second home for me. I form close bonds with my fellow dispatchers, sharing stories, laughter, and tears during our long shifts together. We've become a tight-knit family, supporting each other through the emotional highs and lows that come with a job. It's a demanding career, one that often leaves me feeling physically and emotionally drained at the end of a shift. But as I lay my head down to rest each night, I find solace in the knowledge that I've made a difference in the lives of those who needed me most. Sometimes it feels like a thankless job, one where I just tether the right people to whoever's in trouble. But at times, I get to be the voice that stays on the line during a traumatic moment which spurs me on. I remember it was a cold, rainy night in October when I received the strangest call of my career. My shift had started as usual. It was a weekday, so the first few hours had been relatively quiet. I just settled in with a fresh cup of coffee when the phone rang. Glancing at the caller ID, I was confused that it was coming from my own number. I tapped my phone, which was face up on my desk, to see it was idle on the lock screen. No pocket dial going out, despite it being impossible anyway. So I hesitated for a moment before answering the call. As I picked up the call, my mind raced with thoughts of why that would happen. Maybe it was a similar number, off by one digit, that I'd misread at a glance, or a simple mistake on the system. Either way, my mouth autopiloted the opening words that I'd said 1,000 times over. 911, what is your emergency? The voice on the other end of the line was unmistakably mine, which sent a chill down my spine. It was full of fear and panic. "Alex, I need you to listen to me. I don't have much time. There's going to be an accident on the corner of Oak and Elm in 10 minutes. You have to warn the authorities and get them there before it happens. Lives are at stake." I was dumbfounded. The voice sounded so much like my own that it was impossible to believe it could be anyone else. As the fear in the voice gripped me, I felt my own fear rising. I knew I couldn't afford to let it cloud my judgment though. Maintaining composure was a core part of the job. "Who is this?" I asked hesitantly. "Just trust me, Alex," the voice implored. "You'll understand later. Please, just send help to Oak and Elm. You can prevent a tragedy." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at the phone, my hands shaking, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. My instincts as a dispatcher urged me to treat the call as legitimate, but part of me couldn't help but question the bizarre circumstances. With a deep breath, I decided to trust the voice and dispatched emergency services to the intersection. As I did, I couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. It only just hit me that he knew my name, adding more to the pile of mysteries. I anxiously awaited an update from the responders, hoping beyond hope that I'd made the right choice. When the radio crackled to life, confirming that a major accident had indeed occurred at the exact location and time the voice had predicted, my heart dropped. I was flooded with relief that I'd taken the warning seriously, but at the same time, a sense of dread gnawed at me. If the voice had been right about the accident, what else did it know? Just as I was beginning to process the implications of the first call, the phone rang again. My heart leapt into my throat as I saw my own number displayed once more. The fear and anxiety that had been building within me threatened to overtake me, but I knew that I couldn't let it. I'd been witness to so many traumatic calls that I had a strong resolve, and I pulled on that experience to push me to do my job, despite the horrendously terrifying situation. With a trembling hand, I picked up the call, praying for answers and steeling myself for whatever came next. "Alex," the voice urgently whispered. "I know you're scared, and I know this is difficult to believe, but you have to trust me. There's a woman named Sarah who will call you in exactly 3 minutes. Her abusive ex-boyfriend is trying to break into her apartment. She'll be hiding in the closet. Tell her to stay quiet and send the police to her address immediately." As I listened to the voice, my emotions were a swirling tempest of disbelief and concern. I was terrified by the unexplainable connection I seemed to share with this caller, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore the fact that if the first call was legitimate, then there were potential lives at stake. I felt an immense pressure to make the right decision. "Who are you?" I asked again, my voice wavering. "How do you know all this?" "I can't explain everything right now, but I promise you'll understand soon," the voice replied, a hint of desperation creeping in, almost matching my own. "Please, just trust me." Once again, the line went dead, leaving me with nothing but my racing thoughts and the dull hum of the call center around me. As the seconds ticked by, I felt a growing sense of unease, the tension in the room almost palpable. I glanced around at my colleagues, wondering if they were having a similar experience as me. After the longest 3 minutes of my life, just as the voice had predicted, Sarah's call came through. Her panicked voice echoed in my ear, and I knew that I couldn't ignore the warning I'd been given. I guided Sarah through the terrifying ordeal, keeping her calm as I dispatched the police to a location. All the while, my own emotions threatened to bubble to the surface, a strange sense of connection to this woman I'd never met. When I received the confirmation that Sarah had been safely rescued and her ex-boyfriend apprehended, a wave of relief washed over me. But that relief was short-lived, as the weight of the situation continued to bear down on me. The voice on the phone had known these events would happen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to come. It wasn't long before the third call came. My heart was leaping as my own number appeared on the screen once more. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the phone. I felt a deep sense of dread which screamed at me to tear my hand away. But I couldn't ignore the call, not when lives were potentially on the line. Swallowing hard, I picked up the receiver and braced myself for what was to come. "Alex? Alex," the voice said, now sounding more urgent than ever. "You need to leave the call center right now. There's a gas leak in the building. It's going to explode in less than 5 minutes. You have to get everyone out." My blood ran cold as the gravity of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. Everything that had been building within me throughout the night threatened to overwhelm me, but I knew I couldn't let it. I had to act quick. "How do you know this?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "Who are you?" The voice, now frantic, replied, "Don't freak out, Alex. There isn't time. I'm you. I'm calling from the future. I know this is hard to believe, but you have to trust me. There's no time to explain. You need to evacuate the building right now." My mind raced as I tried to process what I was hearing. Was it really possible that I was speaking to myself from the future? The notion seemed too surreal to be true, yet the evidence was impossible to ignore. I had to make a decision, and I had to make it quickly. Feeling the weight of responsibility bearing down on me, I made my choice. I slammed down the receiver and jumped to my feet, my heart pounding as I rushed to alert my colleagues. With a frantic and confused evacuation, hailed by constant questions from everyone moving past me, I was too deep in thought to explain anything to them. Many protested, knowing how important the job was, and to leave the center was a huge endangerment to the people in need. But I just layered on the urgency until they too left. We barely made it out in time. As we watched from a safe distance, the building was engulfed in flames, the explosion shaking the very ground beneath our feet. I stood there, my fellow dispatchers huddled around me, their faces etched with shock and relief. As the reality of what had just happened began to sink in, I found myself grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. Relief that we had all escaped unharmed, gratitude to the voice that had warned me, and a lingering sense of disbelief that I had truly been communicating with my future self. When asked how I knew what was going to happen, I gave some half-hearted response about smelling something, but most people were too much in shock to probe further than that. But amidst the chaos and confusion, one thing became clear. I had been given a gift, a chance to change the course of my life and the lives of those around me. And I knew I couldn't let that gift go to waste. In the days that followed the explosion, I found myself consumed by the events that had transpired. The voice on the phone, my own voice, had saved countless lives, including my own. And although I struggled to wrap my head around the concept of communicating with my future self, I couldn't deny the reality of what had happened. As I tried to come to terms with the situation, I realized that the knowledge I'd gained could be both a blessing and a curse. I was suddenly faced with the daunting responsibility of this secret knowledge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that every decision I made could have life-altering consequences. The weight of that responsibility felt like an immense burden. But I couldn't let my fear hold me back. I knew that I potentially had a unique opportunity to make a difference, to help those who needed it most. And so, with each passing day, I found myself more determined than ever to trust the voice and see if I can use these calls for good. A nearby building was rented and very quickly set up to take dispatcher calls. It was a necessity, so no expense was spared in getting the setup expedited. I dove headfirst into my work, answering calls with a renewed sense of purpose and urgency. I kept a close eye on the caller ID, always anticipating the next mysterious call from my future self. And when those calls came, I heeded their warnings without hesitation, trusting my own voice to guide me. I found myself constantly on edge. I felt a deep sense of loneliness, knowing that I couldn't share my secret with anyone, not even my closest colleagues. As the days turned into weeks, I began to see the impact of my actions. Lives were saved, tragedies averted, and hope restored. And with each success, I felt my confidence growing, my fears slowly giving way to a sense of pride and accomplishment. I knew that I was walking a fine line, playing with forces that I couldn't fully understand. But in my heart, I believed that I was doing the right thing. No one suspected anything. Often the dispatcher is simply the bridge between the caller and the services, so it was easy to think that it was a coincidence that I had simply been the one to pick up the phone. As I continued to heed the warnings from my stranger self, I came to understand that the greatest power I possessed wasn't the ability to predict the future or change the course of events. Rather, it was the power of choice, the choice to trust an urgent voice, to embrace the unknown. One night, as I sat at my station, the phone rang once again, this time displaying an unknown number. I read it in anticipation as I picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end was familiar, but off, as if it wasn't quite human. "Alex," the voice growled, "you've grown complacent. There's a terrible future ahead of you. I've seen it, and you must prevent it." Dread washed over me, my mind racing as I tried to figure what was happening this time. Was this another version of myself? I listened cautiously as the voice continued. Over the course of several calls, the voice provided cryptic warnings and riddles, each one hinting at a potential disaster or tragedy that I needed to avert. At first, the instructions seemed relatively benign. In the first call, the voice told me about an argument that was about to take place between two of my close friends, which would lead to the end of their friendship. It gave me the exact time and location to intervene and mediate the conflict. I hesitantly followed the instructions, and to my surprise, I managed to prevent the fallout between them. The second call, the voice directed me to leave an anonymous tip to the police about an elderly neighbor who was at risk of a gas leak in her home. The voice claimed that if I didn't act, she would suffer a terrible accident. I wrestled with the decision, but eventually decided to make the call. The next day, I found out that the police had indeed discovered a gas leak in her home and had it repaired just in time. As the calls continued, the voice's aggression and demands began to escalate. It instructed me to break into a co-worker's home to find evidence of a conspiracy plot, convincing me that the co-worker was planning something malicious that would affect many people. Reluctantly, I obliged, only to find seemingly inconclusive evidence, which made me question my actions and the tips I was getting. The next call pushed me further, urging me to sabotage the brakes of a car to prevent an accident that would lead to a catastrophic chain reaction. Each instruction was darker than the last, leaving me increasingly lost compared to the first Alex that was calling me. Still though, there was a chance that I was still doing good. The glimmer of hope sparked by the many calls still stuck in my heart. Fearing the consequences of not heeding the warnings, I began to follow the voice's instructions to the letter, even when they involved morally questionable actions. As I did, I felt my relationships with friends, family and co-workers deteriorate, leaving me isolated and paranoid. As I continued to follow the voice's instructions, a nagging doubt started to grow in the back of my mind. I couldn't help but question whether the voice was genuinely another version of myself or something more sinister. The line between right and wrong had been blurred, and I struggled to make sense of the chaos that had enveloped my life. Feeling increasingly lost and desperate, I decided to do some research, hoping to find answers or any explanation for the bizarre events that had been occurring. I had to dredge through many hoaxes, crackpots with keyboards, and straight-up otherworldly conspiracies. But during my search, I stumbled upon a concept called tulpa, a sentient being created from the collective thoughts, beliefs, and energy of its creator. According to the information I found, a tulpa can become powerful and independent, even capable of interacting with the physical world. The more I read, the more I became convinced that the voice on the phone was a tulpa I had inadvertently created. My loneliness and the emotional turmoil of working in the emergency dispatcher center had given birth to this entity, which had begun to take on a life of its own, something that had been masquerading as my future self all along. It had been using me as a pawn to create scenarios that brought suffering, feeding on the emotional highs and lows it had caused. With this revelation, I knew I had to take control of the situation and reclaim my life. I understood that it fed on my fear, despair and loneliness, so I had to face my emotions and confront the entity head on. I waited for the next call. My anxiety was through the roof as I prepared to confront it, though now for different reasons. When the phone rang, I answered it without hesitation, asserting my newfound determination. "I know what you are," I told the voice firmly, "and I won't let you control me any longer." It laughed, attempting to undermine my resolve. "You think you can just get rid of me, Alex? I'm part of you, you know." I steadied my voice, focusing on staying strong. "I created you, and I can unmake you. I won't let you hurt anyone else." I hung up and carried on through my shift with a forced composure. Realizing that I had to weaken it by depriving it of the negative emotions it fed upon, I began to reconnect with friends and family, rebuilding the relationships I'd neglected while under this thing's influence. I sought professional help to cope with the emotional stress and loneliness I'd experienced as a result of my job. Over time, the caller's power waned. The scenarios it called in were more and more mundane, until all it could conjure was a cat stuck in a tree. As I continued to cultivate positive connections and emotions, its voice grew weaker with each call as it became increasingly desperate to maintain its grip on me. I knew that I had to sever the connection completely to put an end to its existence. One night, I received the final call from my number. I faced it with a sense of calm and determination. "This is the end," I told the voice firmly. "I've taken back control of my life, and you no longer have power over me." The tulpa's voice faded into a whisper, its existence flickering on the edge of oblivion. "You can't do this." But I had already made my choice. "Goodbye," I said, and hung up the phone for the last time. From then on, it was gone, banished from my life forever. I faced my inner demons come real and conquered them, emerging stronger and more resilient than before. The ordeal had taught me valuable lessons about the power of emotions and the importance of staying connected with the people I cared about. As I moved forward with my life, I carried the lessons I had learned with me, determined to use them to shape a brighter and more fulfilling future.